At the outset, I ask unanimous consent that the chair be authorized to declare a recess at any time. Without objection, so ordered. I will start by going over a few housekeeping matters. The committee is holding a hybrid hearing. Members may participate remotely or in person. For individuals participating remotely, the chair or staff designated by the chair may mute a participant's microphone when the participant is not under recognition for the purpose of eliminating inadvertent background noise. If you are participating remotely and are experiencing connectivity issues, please contact staff immediately so those issues can be resolved. Members participating in the hearing room or on the remote platform are responsible for unmuting themselves when they seek recognition. We are not permitted to unmute members unless they explicitly request assistance. If you are participating remotely and I notice that you have not unmuted yourself, I will ask you if you would like staff to unmute you. If you indicate approval by nodding, staff will unmute your microphone. They will not unmute your microphone under any other conditions. I'd like to remind members participating remotely in this proceeding to keep your camera on at all times, even if you are not under recognition by the chair. Members may not participate in more than one committee proceeding simultaneously. If you are on the remote platform and choose to participate in a different proceeding, please turn your camera off. Finally, we have established an email inbox for submitting documents before and during committee proceedings, and we have distributed that email address to your staff. Now I will introduce our witnesses. This morning, we will be hearing from Dr. Julia Coronado, the founder and president of Macro Policy Perspectives, the Honorable Vince Williams, the mayor of Union City, Georgia, and the president of the National League of Cities, Ms. Sharon Parrott, the president of the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities, and Mr. Stephen Moore, chair of the Save America Coalition, the American First Policy Institute, and a distinguished fellow in economics at the Heritage Foundation. We welcome all of you. I now yield myself 5 minutes for an opening statement. Good morning. I want to welcome our distinguished panel of witnesses. Thank you for joining us for this important hearing on the American Rescue Plan. This legislation, which I was proud to sponsor, was signed into law 15 months ago. A lot has changed since then, and the American people have benefited enormously from the provisions of this law. But they've also been subjected to a lot of misinformation about the law. So today, I want to start by laying out the facts. In 2021, the Rescue Plan powered the strongest economic growth in nearly 40 years, helping to improve our fiscal standing and laying the foundation for our record-breaking recovery. On the jobs front, before the Rescue Plan, the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office projected our unemployment rate would be 5% right now, and that it wouldn't drop below 4% within this decade. Thanks to the Rescue Plan, unemployment is near historic lows at 3.6%. 17 states, including my home state of Kentucky, are seeing their lowest unemployment rates on record. In fact, the Rescue Plan nearly doubled GDP growth and led to the creation of 4 million additional jobs in 2021. That's millions of Americans earning a paycheck as a direct result of the Rescue Plan. And it's not only jobs. Incomes are up too, by more than 5% overall, and by nearly 12% for the lowest earning workers. That's even after accounting for inflation. The child poverty rate dropped nearly 40% from 2020 to 2021. Despite the economic fallout of the pandemic and the possibility of a wave of evictions, foreclosures hit an all-time low last year. Across the board, the data shows that the Rescue Plan helped American families enormously, ensuring they could put food on the table, stay in their homes, and avoid economic devastation despite the turbulent times. The law was also enormously beneficial to state and local governments. During the Great Recession, the contraction at the state and local level hurt our overall recovery and prevented states from addressing community needs and longer-term impacts of the recession. This time, funding from the Rescue Plan helped state and local governments avoid massive layoffs, keeping teachers, firefighters, police, and millions of other essential workers on the job. Local leaders had the resources necessary to meet urgent needs and ensure their communities came out of the pandemic better than they went into it. Not only was the Rescue Plan more effective than other aid packages during the previous recession, it also helped the United States recover more quickly than other nations. In fact, The U.S. had the fastest economic recovery among the G7 countries, and our economy is projected to be larger at the end of this year relative to its pre-pandemic size than any other G7 economy. Clearly, we have made significant progress, but now inflation is a challenge. Again, here are the facts. Experts across the ideological spectrum agree that the main drivers of current inflation are international supply chain issues and energy price hikes caused by Russia's war in Ukraine. These are global challenges, which is why inflation is a global issue. As Treasury Secretary Yellen said last week, quote, "We're seeing high inflation in almost all of the developed countries around the world, and they have very different fiscal policies." But unlike our global counterparts, America is in a better place to face these economic headwinds because of the American Rescue Plan. We have avoided the kind of long-lasting financial damage to families and communities that typically follows an economic downturn of the size we experienced. We have avoided the grim forecast CBO projected before the rescue plan. We saved our economy and we delivered life-saving and life-changing relief to families across the country, all while fueling the most equitable and impressive economic recovery in recent memory. There's a lot to learn from the rescue plan and the important role the federal government can play in the lives of Americans. I look forward to discussing this further with our esteemed panel of witnesses today. With that, I would like to yield to the ranking member, Mr. Smith, 5 minutes for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's been over 15 months since the $2 trillion American Rescue Plan, as I refer to it, the Biden bailout bill, was signed into law, sparking the highest inflation in 40 years. Inflation has risen 12.2% since Joe Biden took the oath of office. We have seen gas prices surge to 109% above since Joe Biden took the oath of office. I want to thank Chairman for agreeing to hold this oversight hearing. We've been asking for it for some time, and yet this oversight hearing undercut by the fact that President Biden's rescue czar, Gene Sperling, and Treasury Secretary Yellen are not here. Mr. Chairman, as you know, I sent you a letter requesting you add a second panel of executive branch witnesses for the hearing so Mr. Sperling and Secretary Yellen could answer the questions they have thus far ignored from our timeless efforts one after another. And I ask unanimous consent to submit the letter to the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Sperling was appointed to oversee the implementation of this $2 trillion boondoggle. Secretary Yellen's department is responsible for administering over $1 trillion worth of its programs and benefits. Many of these made it more rewarding to stay out of the workforce in 2021 than seek gainful employment, worsening the labor and supply chain problems we see today. For over a year, we have cataloged numerous examples of ridiculous waste of federal tax dollars from the American Rescue Plan, $1,400 stimulus checks to Japanese citizens living in Japan, $783 million to checks to prisoners, $2 million to purchase a ski area, $140 million for luxury hotel developments in Florida, $20 million to modernize fish hatcheries in Maine, $4 million for a bird sanctuary, $2 million for a golf course. Sounds like a lot, but there's a lot more. $15 million of taxpayer dollars to help develop a venue in New Jersey to host the 2026 World Cup. $7 million to social media influencers to promote seafood. $2 million to plant trees in New York. $5 million for a moonshine walking trail, $7 million for horse racing in Arizona, $250,000 for pickleball courts, $800,000 for luxury apartments in Connecticut, and $4 million for beach bathrooms and parking lots in South Carolina. This list goes on and on. This is why we need answers from the administration. So what did American families get? I'll tell you, they got higher prices and lower real wages. inflation began to rise to the fastest level in 40 years the month after Democrats passed the $2 trillion bill. Inflation was 1.7% in February of 2021, the month before passage of this boondoggle. The economy shrank 1.5% in the first quarter of 2022, 4.4 percentage points lower than where the Congressional Budget Office said it should be prior to passage of this boondoggle. The labor force participation rate is still below pre-COVID levels. The deficit in 2021 was $517 billion higher than the Congressional Budget Office said it would have been before passage of this boondoggle. At $2.78 trillion deficit, it was the second highest deficit in the history of this nation. Interest rates are rising faster than it has seen in 30 years. When Joe Biden took office, the CBO predicted no tax rates until 2024. We have two already, one expected this week. In February 2021, CBO reported that the economic growth would return to pre-pandemic levels by the middle of last year, and unemployment would continue to decline, all without further federal government stimulus. Despite this, and with $1 trillion in unspent COVID money, Democrats chose to gamble with the financial security of the American people. Our Democrat colleagues are holding this hearing to take a victory lap which shows just how out of touch they are with what real Americans are facing with uncontrollable inflation. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman for his opening statement. 2 points. One is you misspoke. You said tax rates instead of interest rates. I'm just correcting it for your benefit.
Thank you. Interest rates are continuing to rise under this administration.
And secondly, just for point of information, we did extend an invitation to Treasury Secretary Yellen, and she was unable to attend, but we did make the invitation to her. Now, I'd like to once again thank our witnesses for being here this morning. The committee has received your written statements, and they will be made part of the formal hearing record. You each will have 5 minutes to give your oral remarks. Dr. Coronado, you may begin when you're ready.
Can't hear.
Before the ARP's passage, forecasters expected a solid GDP performance, but in the event, real GDP grew 5.7% in 2021, the fastest pace since 1983, and the unemployment rate fell to 3.9%, the fastest one-year decline on record. It is worth revisiting why policy erred on the side of generosity during the pandemic. The recovery from the Great Recession of 2008 featured too little policy support and a labor market that left millions of Americans on the sidelines for years. It took more than 6 years for the labor market to regain the 2007 level of employment, and only after that did the labor force participation rate of prime-aged workers aged 25 to 54 begin to recover. During the pandemic, prime-age labor force participation again fell sharply, but a decisive recovery in both jobs and participation has been ongoing for the past 12 months. We are on track to exceed pre-pandemic levels of employment and prime-age participation in the next 6 months, which would be the fastest labor market recovery in 4 decades. There's an extensive literature in economics on labor market scarring, that is, permanently lower earnings that result when people experience long spells of unemployment or labor force disengagement. Unemployment also adds to income inequality. Unemployment for lower wage and non-white workers rises more in a recession and falls more slowly in a recovery. The disastrously slow labor market recovery from the Great Recession led to a policy reorientation that prioritized speed of the recovery. A strong labor market and fiscal support has meant a broader-based and more inclusive recovery. Workers have had more financial space to bide their time, change employers, and find the right situation for themselves and their families. Younger, non-white, and lower wage workers hit harder by job losses during the pandemic are seeing by far the biggest wage gains and can obtain full-time jobs more readily when they want them. The financial benefits of supporting households has also been broad-based. Delinquencies on virtually every loan category have fallen through the recession, the first time we have ever seen an improvement in credit quality through a downturn. Employers have had to adapt to this strong labor market, but have largely been able to do so. Business profitability and productivity have risen strongly through the pandemic, and applications for new business formation have soared to new highs. It may sound jarring to describe the U.S. economy in such glowing terms when inflation is soaring and there's rising talk of a recession, but diagnosing the drivers of inflation is key to developing an effective policy response. Excluding food and energy and adjusting for differences in methodology, U.S. core inflation did rise earlier and higher than other advanced economies, which surely reflects in some part the stronger policy response. But all countries have seen core inflation that is 2.5 to 3.5 percentage points above pre-pandemic trends, highlighting that pandemic disruptions, including COVID-related shutdowns and supply chain frictions, are an important driver of inflation that we are seeing. At the same time, the U.S. has also experienced the strongest recovery in the world in terms of real GDP growth. The more recent spike in food and energy prices is tied directly to the war in Ukraine and will act as a tax on U.S. consumers. The Fed has been tightening monetary policy, which should cool demand and inflationary pressures in coming months, but lingering supply chain frictions and the vulnerability of food and energy prices to the actions of despots who seek to weaken Western democracies and economies will not be addressed through monetary policy and require a more structural response. Viewing high inflation primarily through the lens of budget deficits is also not likely to be helpful. The federal government ran the largest April surplus in history this year, and a strong economy is producing stronger than expected tax receipts, while the expiration of ARP programs has led to an 18% decline in outlays. Yet supply chain frictions and war inflation are still with us. At least a strong economy gives consumers the best shot possible of weathering rising interest rates and the war shock. The pandemic has been a huge shock to the global economic system. Strong policy support has led to a robust U.S. recovery, but now is the time to address some of the structural elements of this disruption. That will be key to not only bringing inflation down, but meeting the challenges of the energy transition and preserving Western-style democracies. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Dr. Coronado, for that statement. Now recognize Mayor Williams for 5 minutes. You may begin when you're ready.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Yarmouth and the committee for allowing me this opportunity to be here to talk to you and share with you some of the great things that have happened since ARPA, the passing of ARPA, on behalf of all cities, towns, and villages across this nation. Again, I am Vince Williams, Mayor of the City of Union City, Georgia, and also the proud president of the National League of Cities. Union City is a community of over 26,000 proud residents, 88% of whom are African American. Before COVID, Union City was trending in the right direction by nearly every measure. We were revitalizing neighborhoods through immense new investment by businesses in our city and had increased our local revenue by over 81% through economic activity and job creation. Our finances are in order, and nothing about my city or any city suggested a bailout. Because the whole nation was set back by COVID-19, so was Union City. ARPA local government grants have given all cities, towns, and villages in our nation the ability to be part of a national economic recovery from bottom up, starting with our hardest hit residents. It's not like past efforts when decisions were made in a federal office far away from where problems truly happened. From the start, Union City followed the advice of public health experts, as we still do today, and state and federal rules. We knew there would be trade-offs, but we never thought we would have to go it alone. Pausing nearly every local economy while ramping up response to a global health crisis created the kinds of economic uncertainty that the federal government is uniquely authorized to address. For local governments, the public health crisis was inseparable from the economic crisis. It laid bare long-standing health disparities that underlie why losses have happened in cities in such uneven ways. Households in lower income communities are at greater risk of bad health outcomes, which worsen the effects of COVID-19. This is evident across Metro Atlanta, where lifespans vary by as much as 2 decades based on your neighborhood or zip code. Union City is investing in the Greenway Trail with ARPA funds. Why? A greenway is a sought-after amenity. It will raise the value of the community and encourage accessible, affordable ways for our residents to be healthier. As a determinant of health, our built environment must facilitate healthier outcomes, or at least not be an impediment, so that we will be less susceptible to the next COVID wave or the next pandemic. And the injection of ARPA funds gives us access to the capital our city needs to put contractors and laborers to work. Imagine the transformation. Today, there are only 2 parks in Union City. This project will connect everyone in the community with a recreational system that gives families across the city the opportunity to conveniently access outdoor recreation space. My city is also spending to reduce food insecurities and to upgrade water, wastewater, and stormwater systems. Our municipal workers in every department are our heroes. For many of them, virtual work is not and was not an option. Imagine for a moment, your hometown government has just shut down. Who would fix the busted water pipes flooding your streets in the middle of the night? To acknowledge their work through the pandemic, the city also offered premium pay of $3,000 to eligible employees. This is not only a recognition of excellent work during tough times, it's also an investment in maintaining a qualified and trained workforce for the future. We should note the substantial contributions of local governments to the private economy. Some cities had more than 30% of water and sewer residential and business customers on a cutoff list for non-payment, many 90 days late or more. Yet local leaders made the painful but right decision to maintain service and absorb losses. To not have done so would have increased homelessness and joblessness and unhealthy conditions. City fiscal conditions are also a good indicator of how well low and middle income households are doing. When there is opportunity for lower income households and the middle class is growing, local tax revenue goes up. When the middle class experiences declines, so will local tax revenue. We call that Main Street. The state and local fiscal recovery fund is a Main Street program. I am sure members of Congress have questions regarding specific expenditures in their districts. I'll conclude by encouraging you to first learn more about the context of such expenditures by giving local leaders the courtesy of a phone call or certainly a much needed visit to explain what their expenditure is all about. Thank you, Chairman Yarmuth and members of the committee. I appreciate this time.
Thank you, Mayor Williams. I now recognize Ms. Parrott for 5 minutes for her opening statement. You can unmute your machine and begin.
Thank you very much. Chairman Yarmuth, Ranking Member Smith, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify here today. I'm Sharon Parrott, president of the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, a nonpartisan research and policy institute here in Washington, D.C. I'm here to discuss 3 lessons we can learn from the overwhelmingly successful COVID relief efforts of the last few years, including the 2021 American Rescue Plan, as well as the measures enacted in 2020. First, we saw that a timely, robust fiscal policy response can greatly speed and strengthen an economic recovery. Relief efforts during the pandemic spurred a remarkable recovery that made the COVID-19 recession the shortest on record and brought the unemployment rate, which peaked at 14.7% in April 2020, down to 3.6% today. 2 years after the Great Recession, when the federal response was both historic and undersized, unemployment was still at 9.9%. While the causes of the 2 recessions were different, there is little question that the policy response to the pandemic fostered a stronger and swifter recovery. Second, Well-designed relief measures can greatly reduce the harm done by a recession or a crisis, preventing spikes in serious forms of hardship. Relief measures drove poverty down to a record low in 2020 after counting government assistance, and prevented spikes in food insecurity and homelessness. While annual poverty data are not yet available for 2021, one study at Columbia University estimated that the American Rescue Plan alone reduced annual poverty that year by more than 12 million people, including 5.6 million children, a reduction in child poverty of more than 50%. Relief measures included both broad-based policies like economic impact payments and policies targeted to those facing the greatest hardship, like expanded food assistance, housing, healthcare, and unemployment benefits, and extending the full child tax credit to the lowest income children. Absent relief measures, unemployment likely would have spelled financial disaster for millions of people. Evictions and the number of children facing food insecurity would have soared. The ranks of the uninsured would have risen. Instead, jobless workers got robust unemployment benefits that helped families and the economy. Families got additional nutrition assistance, including additional help when schools were closed. Evictions were averted, first through a moratorium and then through emergency rental assistance that has now helped more than 5.7 million households. Medicaid expanded, and in 2021, Affordable Care Act marketplace premiums became far more affordable, helping more people get and stay insured. Childcare providers got help to stay in business, and families got more help too. These targeted policies helped a broad swath of families who fell on hard times. They were particularly important to people hard hit by the pandemic itself, who worked in industries that saw large job losses, and who came into the crisis with fewer assets to lean on. This includes a disproportionate number of people of color who often have seen their opportunities shortchanged by structural racism and discrimination in employment, housing, and education. Of course, the relief effort wasn't perfect. Some families experienced long delays in aid, and policymakers allowed help to lapse in the latter half of 2020, which needlessly increased economic insecurity and contributed to a flagging recovery in the latter part of 2020. Now, it's important to note that large-scale temporary relief measures were needed in part because of weaknesses in the nation's underlying economic and health security policies. For example, our regular unemployment insurance system leaves out a large share of unemployed workers and provides low benefits to many who do qualify. Emergency temporary measures were needed, and they were difficult to implement because they were built on a rickety foundation. That brings me to my third lesson. Some of the temporary relief measures proved effective at combating problems that long predated the pandemic, and they point the way to policy advances we should adopt on an ongoing basis. Examples include supporting low-income children through an expanded child tax credit that's fully available to the lowest income families, making marketplace coverage more affordable, supporting workers by expanding the EITC and revamping the unemployment insurance system, supporting both kids and families by providing access to affordable quality childcare, and preventing housing instability and homelessness by expanding rental assistance. In sum, COVID relief efforts sharply reduced poverty and hardship and spurred a strong and swift recovery. But shoring up our ongoing economic and health security policies would both improve well-being during normal economic times and make our nation more resilient to future recessions and crises. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Parrott. I now recognize Mr. Moore for 5 minutes. Unmute your mic and proceed. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Testify before this committee. I'm honored to be here, and thank you, Mr. Smith, for the invitation as well. To say the least, the timing of this hearing is extremely unfortunate, given what's happening with the American economy as we speak. We have now $5 gasoline in this country, and in many states we have $6 to $7 a gallon of gasoline. It was $2.39 when Trump left office. We now have a 9% inflation in the U.S., and the numbers just came out this morning, unfortunately, on the producer price index numbers. We're up to 10%. Producer price index. That, of course, means that consumer prices are going to rise in the months ahead. We haven't peaked on inflation. It's not transitory. We've increased the national debt over the last 2 years by $4 trillion, which is a disgrace. And most importantly, and I hope you'll all focus on this, By most estimates, in the last 14 months or so, the average family in America, the median family income, has dropped by $3,500 in real terms. Let me say that again, a $3,500 reduction in real median income. Now, we don't have the official numbers yet. We'll get those in September, but I track these numbers pretty closely. It'll be close to that. And that's because you have this huge hurdle of 8.5% inflation. That means nominal incomes have to go up by at least 8.5%, and wages have to go up by that amount just to keep pace with inflation. You all know we're at 5% wage growth, so nowhere near. And so, incidentally, under Trump, and I worked for Donald Trump. I was one of the senior economic advisors. You know, we cut taxes, we reduced regulations, we got government off the back of our businesses. And one of the things we're most proud of is that we saw over those 4 years a $6,500 increase in median family income. That's huge. That's a huge amount of economic progress. And incidentally, minorities saw huge gains. Hispanics and blacks saw, and we're really proud of that, the gains that were made with Hispanics and blacks. So frankly, to have a hearing today that's saying that this economic strategy has been a success is delusional and dangerous. And when I talk to people outside the Beltway, they think it's just further evidence that Washington is completely out of touch, frankly, with the real problems that Americans are facing and paying their bills. So there were we've lived through 3 economic crises in my lifetime. The economic crisis of the 1970s, when we had the massive inflation and the stagflation that happened when Reagan came into office. We had, of course, the financial crisis of 2007 and 8. And then, of course, we had the COVID crisis. And it's so important that we learn the lessons of what works and what doesn't work. So Reagan came in the middle of what was arguably the greatest crisis since the Great Depression. And what did Reagan do? We did not have a massive spending stimulus. Reagan cut taxes, reduced regulations, and we got control of the money supply with Paul Volcker at the Fed, something that should be happening now. And we saw a ferocious recovery. What happened in the 80s was an economic miracle that no one thought was possible. Mr. McClintock, the economic recovery was so strong that it was like we added another California to the economy under the Reagan years. So obviously that strategy worked. Then we tried what happened under the Obama years. And Ms. Coronado is right. We tried $200 billion of stimulus spending, and it was a complete failure. We had the worst recovery from a recession in modern times. It was a horrific recession. We were in effectively a recession for 5 years. And the thing that's so amazing is that the lesson that many on the left learned was we didn't spend enough money. We didn't spend enough. So instead of doubling down and tripling down, and we quadrupled down. And instead of spending $250 billion, we spent $1 trillion, or actually $2 trillion. And now we see the result of this. It's economic wreckage, in my opinion. Now, yes, the jobs market is strong right now. There's no question about it. It's the best jobs market right now that I've seen in my lifetime. But I've got to tell you, it does not look good right now. I'm very, very worried about a recession. This could be very severe. And I think most economists would agree with me. So we should learn the lessons of what's happened here. This was not a success. And to call this a success is really problematic, because the first stage of any kind of recovery, if you have an addiction, is to acknowledge you have a problem, and to not acknowledge that we have a massive budget that's out of control, that we have an economy that's teetering on a recession, that Americans are suffering greatly in terms of their purchasing power and their incomes, is problematic. And so let's learn the lessons. Let's get it right. We should cut taxes going forward, not increase government spending. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Moore. We'll now begin our Q&A session. And as is my customary proceeding, I will reserve my time till the end. So I now recognize the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Kildee, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing, and for the witnesses for your participation to discuss the effect of the American Rescue Plan and how it impacted working families. It is important for us to remind ourselves that in the first few months of the pandemic, 22 million people lost their jobs. 22 million of our fellow Americans. And while our unemployment rate is now much lower and our economic recovery has gained most of these jobs back, it's important to remember that the quick and decisive passage of the American Rescue Plan, despite some of what may have been said, did help to save our economy. The choice of doing nothing was not an acceptable choice given the circumstances. Otherwise, we obviously would have risked spiraling into what could have been another Great Depression. The pandemic also exposed weaknesses in our economy, including our reliance on foreign supply chains for critical components and goods. And of course, because of the pandemic and broken supply chains, and now Vladimir Putin's war in Ukraine, I know a lot of families are experiencing higher costs because of inflation. We acknowledge that. But what my focus has been, and many of us have been working on, is lowering costs for working families, lowering costs on gasoline, prescription drugs, groceries. And so I'm happy to see that Congress will once again this week act on legislation to fix supply chains, pass the Lower Food and Fuel Cost Act to provide relief for families. The title of today's hearing suggests the American Rescue Plan focused on helping working families, not people at the top, and provided meaningful support in the form of tax cuts for working families. 1 million Michigan families with children got a monthly tax cut. In my district alone, the middle class tax cut put millions of dollars back into the pockets of hardworking Michigan families. For mothers like Cordelia, a single working mom I represent, she has twin daughters in my hometown of Flint. These tax cuts made a huge difference, helping her afford school supplies, school uniforms, shoes, socks, coats, the basics for her two daughters. But that's just one story among millions. Millions of Michiganders and Americans who were helped through this terrible period by those important tax cuts for American families. So, Ms. Parrott, I wonder if you might, you mentioned it in your opening statement, but I wonder if you might go a little further to describe how these important tax cuts helped working families, their individual budgets, and also help boost the American economy.
Yes, thank you for the question. The monthly payments provided through the child tax credit provided a lifeline to families in 2021. We have data that tell us what families spent the money on. When we look at low-income families for whom the increase was the largest, because for the first time, we ensured that low-income children got the same child tax credit that middle-income children received. When we look at low-income children, we ask the question, what did they spend it on? We get the answer that I think most of us would expect. They spent it on food, they spent it on rent, they spent it on their mortgage, they spent it on school supplies, they spent it on childcare, they spent it on all the things that families need to care for their children. Many of them used it for broadband access, which during the pandemic was entirely essential for their children's schooling and for their families' connection and interconnection to the economy. Others paid down debt. With the flexibility that came from monthly cash payments, families made decisions that supported their children and the needs of their families. They had the ability to make those decisions for themselves. We also have real-time data that showed some of the positive impacts that families felt. After the first round of monthly payments, the share of adults with children reporting that their family didn't have enough to eat in the past 7 days dropped significantly and rapidly, according to data from the Census Bureau. Just stop and think about that for a moment. We provided a modest monthly child tax credit to families, and fewer kids were in families struggling to afford food here in the United States of America. More broadly, in 2021, among parents with incomes under $25,000, the share doing at least okay financially in response, that's how the question was worded in the survey, rose by 13%, according to a report issued by the Federal Reserve. And similarly, the share of parents across income levels who would be able to pay for a $400 unexpected expense with cash rose from 56% in 2020 to 64% in 2021. Again, I want you to think about what it means for a family to be able to absorb a $400 increased cost. A car breaks down, a repair in the house is needed. For many of us, $400 doesn't seem like a lot. And for these families, it made all the difference. to being able to absorb that kind of cost. The last point I'd just like to make is that helping families with kids make ends meet has long-term positive impacts. A large body of research finds that lifting children out of poverty and preventing hardship yields important dividends for children's and parents' emotional well-being, children's short and long-term health outcomes, and success in reading and math, their school completion, their future earnings prospects. In short, for the future well-being of the next generation of adults. That's why it's so important that we do these things not only during crisis times, but in normal times to help our kids have a chance to succeed. Thank you.
Thank you so much. My time's expired. I again thank the witnesses for their participation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for this hearing. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired, and now yield 10 minutes to the ranking member, Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Moore, a common excuse that we hear from our Democrat colleagues over and over when it comes to high inflation is that it's Putin's fault. First, when inflation was an issue, Democrats, folks in the administration said it was temporary, it was transitional. They said it was a high-class problem. Now they're saying it's Putin's fault. So what is your response when you hear Democrats say that inflation is high because Putin invaded Ukraine at the end of February 2022? Never mind the fact that inflation had been rising since the American Rescue Plan was passed and was already up by 7.5% before Putin ever moved any forces.
So a couple observations. First, the recovery began in around June of 2020. So the second half of 2020, the economy grew by about 20%. It was the fastest recovery. So this idea that somehow the recovery began with the American Recovery Act is just plainly false. The growth happened, the real growth happened in the second half of this of 2020. And the thing that's kind of missed in all of this is that what happened with the economy is we made a huge mistake. We shut down our economy. We shut down our businesses. We shut down our restaurants. We shut down our churches. It was catastrophic. And now we have the evidence that the health benefits of that were de minimis. So we got almost no health benefits, but we did incredible damage to our economy. Now, here's the interesting thing that happened. Starting in around June of 2020, most of the red states in America, Florida, Tennessee, Texas, Utah, Iowa, Nebraska, Missouri, those states opened up. Because one of the things that Trump did that was really brilliant, and he made mistakes, anybody would make a mistake in that kind of crisis, but he allowed federalism to work. And he said, we're going to let the states decide their policy. Now, Mr. McClintock, your state didn't do a very good job of it. Your state was a disaster. And by the way, the death rate when you adjust for age was no higher in Florida than it was in California. For the second half of 2020, Florida was almost completely wide open, and California, as you know, was completely shut down. So these problems the problems that you're all talking about were in the blue states in America that made a bad decision on that. Now, so we had a big recovery in the second half of 2020. Do you know, Mr. Smith, what the inflation rate was the month Trump left office? I know exactly that.
1.4?
1.4%. So how do you go from 1.4% inflation to 8.6% inflation in 14 months? You can't blame it on the recovery because we already had a ferocious recovery.
You spent $2 trillion.
It was clear. Now, look, there were a lot of factors, but the match that lit this forest fire was the $1.9 trillion. Plus, let's not forget, then we passed a $1.1 trillion so-called infrastructure bill. So that's $3 trillion of spending. Now, let me just make one other quick point.
Okay, let's make it quick because I'm running out of time.
The economists, there were 14 Nobel Prize economists who said there'd be no inflation. Mr. Chairman, with all due respect, you said there'd be no inflation. Wrong. We now have, and inflation is the cruelest tax of all. It is the one thing, you talk about poverty, the thing that's going to drive millions and millions of families into poverty is this high inflation rate.
So I just want to say this. Another thing that our colleagues said, they try to say over and over, that inflation is a global problem. And I just want to chat with you a little bit about this. The U.S. economy is 25% of the entire world's economy. 25%. So 1/4 of the world's economy. It's larger than the economies of Canada, France, Germany, Italy, and the United Kingdom combined. So when the US decides to spend $2 trillion, it's going to have a global impact when they control 1/4 of the economy. What is your response to given that the inflation in the US is actually higher than it is everywhere?
It's a great question. And in my opinion, the world is pretty dollar denominated. We are the world reserve currency. I mean, Mr. Chairman, you've made that point many times. So this happened as the same thing happened in the 70s. When we have inflation, inflation spreads around the world. So this is like reverse foreign aid. We're actually hurting all of these other countries in the world because, the euro is indirectly tied to the dollar. So many other countries basically peg China, for example, is essentially pegged their yuan to the dollar. So we export inflation when we have inflation here. And that explains why if we bring our inflation rate down, Mr. Smith, I guarantee you the rest of the world will see a decline in inflation as well.
So despite the rosy commentary from the Biden administration and Democrats that you'll hear today, here are the facts. The economy shrank 1.5% in the first quarter.
Right.
This year, labor force participation is below what it was before the pandemic. The largest consumer price index has inflation up 8.6%. Since President Biden took office, inflation is up 12.2%. The Fed has already increased interest rates twice this year, with another increase poised to take place tomorrow. Real wages are down 4.2% since Joe Biden took office, and gas is up 110%. And the 2021 deficit at $2.78 trillion was the second highest on record, $517 billion more than CBO said it should have been. What do you think our economy will look like? What effect specifically did the American Rescue Plan have on economic growth and inflation?
Well, look, there was a huge stimulus at the beginning of 2021. There's no question about it. And that stimulus was not the American Recovery Act. I actually think that was negative for the economy. The stimulus, Mr. Smith, was Operation Warp Speed. We had a virus, and a vaccine, and that vaccine allowed millions and millions of more businesses to reopen their doors and allowed millions and millions of Americans to go back to work. I frankly think that if Trump had been president over the last, we would not be facing this situation. We would have a booming economy. We lowered the poverty rate under Trump's policies to the lowest level in recorded history for Blacks, Hispanics, women, any group you want to talk about. You want to talk about reducing poverty rates in this country? Trump did it.
Exactly. In your statement earlier, you made the comment that we should cut taxes, and it's quite interesting. What the Democrats keep trying to do over and over is to spin the Build Back Better, the Build Back Broke bill. They keep revitalizing it, which is over $1 trillion in tax increases, taxes on U.S. energy to increase gas prices, but yet they want to continue to spend money. So would you say that passing the Build Back Broke Act, as I refer to it, which would increase taxes on Americans, increase taxes on U.S. energy, and also increase government spending, do you think that's the solution to our economy right now?
So can I say something nice about a Democrat, Mr. Smith? Because I am a kind of a nonpartisan guy. I mean, Joe Manchin saved this country. Joe Manchin saved this country. If we had passed that, at that time, that bill was by many estimates, $4 trillion. I mean, I shudder to think, if you think, 8, 9, 10% inflation is bad, if we had passed that bill, I think we'd talking about inflation rates that could have hit 15%.
Thank you. I want to ask Dr. Coronado, in February of 2021, you took to Twitter to dismiss concerns Dr. Larry Summers raised about inflation and the American Rescue Plan. You gave the concerns a thumbs down and said he was invoking an inflation boogeyman. Later the same month on Twitter, you pushed around a tweet from a New York Times author who said in his post that the fear of inflation has become a greater threat to the American economy than inflation itself. A month after that, you said People with terrible track records forecasting who refuse to acknowledge and learn from their mistakes do not deserve to be at the center of our or set the terms of policy discussions. In fairness, you were not alone. The Biden administration, numerous Democrats have similarly dismissed inflation, but given what you know now, would you agree that dismissing inflation concerns back in 2021 was a mistake?
I also, as a forecaster, and I make my living as a forecaster, I have to acknowledge my mistakes. And so I definitely underestimated the persistence of the supply chain issues. I would say part of that is just that the pandemic, we all expected it to be short-lived and go away. And in fact, it didn't. And we're still dealing with supply chain shutdowns in China today. So that's a real problem, and we've built that into our thinking about inflation. If I think about the current rate of inflation, I think it goes into three main buckets. One is those pandemic-related frictions that have disrupted the entire global economy. We were at an incredibly integrated place of global supply chains and efficiency, and that entire model has been disrupted by the pandemic. That was exacerbated also by a shift to spending on goods over services. That was unanticipated. I mean, we should have, in retrospect, maybe anticipated that everybody was hunkered down and not spending on services, which is more than 2/3 of consumer spending. And so they had a lot of spending power to spend on goods, and that strained global supply chains. My hope is that supply friction that we've uncovered will see some improvement in productivity and efficiency, investment into those supply chains to improve their resiliency as we go forward. The other bucket that's the dominant one right now is food and energy prices. That is tied to the war in Ukraine. That's not something that came from the American Rescue Plan or anything that the Biden administration done. That came from the decision of Vladimir Putin to invade Ukraine. And so we need to be thinking about, again, ways we can address the supply side of food and energy to give some relief to U.S. consumers.
I see that my time has expired. Food prices continue to go up prior to invasion of Ukraine as well. They've continued to increase, but we have the data. Thank you.
The gentleman's time has expired. Did you want to finish your answer?
Well, I mean, I would say it would be certainly stimulating the U.S. economy was one contributor to higher inflation relative to other countries. But one of what you cited in my tweets, and I still have that same frustration, is we got something for this stimulus. Very, very important outcomes. We've gotten the strongest labor market in 2 generations. And I live outside the Beltway. I see it all around me and all kinds of people. And it's the working class people that are reaping the benefits of this strong labor market more than anybody else. And that's the reality. I know the numbers too. I live by them, and they are quite impressive.
The gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Lee, for 5
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and our ranking member, for having this important hearing, and thank you to all of our witnesses. First of all, it seems like it's lost on Republicans that one of the major outcomes of the rescue plan is we save lives and livelihoods. And if that's not important, I don't know what is. People are alive because of that. People are surviving and beginning to thrive because of the rescue plan. And that's bottom line. And also, let me just say, I very clearly remember Reaganomics. The rich got richer and the poor got poorer. And every time I see a homeless veteran, I think of Reaganomics. And so I know what Reaganomics did, especially for low-income people and people of color. Let me ask you, anyone can answer this. I'd like to hear from all of our witnesses in terms of low-income communities, the issues around income inequality and structural racism. People were living on the edge before the pandemic. People were barely surviving. And I know for people of color, the structural racism and the issues around income inequality is why. And so I'm wondering now, the structural issues, the institutional issues, the policy changes that are necessary so that people don't fall back into those same old systems. Did we address any policy changes, any of the structural issues so that so that people who've been living on the edge can move forward now, not have to go through the same rigmarole that they've had to go through because of their race or because of their economic status?
Thank you. I'll dive in. I've been Black all my life, and my city certainly is predominantly African American, as I stated, 88%. And what I do want to say is, I must say this. I take issue with being referred to as delusional, because I work in my community day in and day out. I'm in the streets each and every day, making sure that families are moving towards being better. But one of the things that I can say that we used and chose to use the money in a deliberative fashion in my community was seeking and making sure that our community had a voice in some of the things that we would do to get the best bang for the funding that we received. It is rare and unprecedented in my lifetime that the federal government gave grants to every and so many units of local governments. At the same time, the city, we knew that there were critical investments that had to be made to stabilize our community, to afford all of our members of the community. I don't operate Republican or Democrat as a mayor. I don't have that luxury. So I'm a little concerned of the conversations that we're having, because it seems like I might be in the wrong room. But I do know what I have been focusing on is to uplift my community and those communities that I serve, but also working with the members of the National League of Cities that we serve over 19,000 cities, towns, and villages, which provide service to over 200 million people, and many of those are people of color. So certainly this has been a great opportunity, and it still is a great opportunity for us to do more. People are getting back to work. We have an unfortunate situation because of COVID-19 pandemic. Stressed supply chains have been a big problem, and we know that. But I am very concerned that this conversation is shifting in another direction. But, ma'am, thank you, and I hope that helps you.
Thank you. And Ms. Parrott, could you also respond in terms of not just providing more resources, but are we changing those systems that are barriers for people of color and low-income people?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think that the American Rescue Plan did a lot to push against the spike in hardship that we would have seen that would have disproportionately fallen on communities of color that have for centuries faced systemic racism, which is why they came into the crisis with fewer assets, lower income, more vulnerabilities to both the virus itself and the economic fallout. But temporary measures can't solve permanent problems. And one of the things that's, I think, important and exciting is that we tested some things that worked, that could push back in a more systemic way, and that really paint the way or pave a path for the future. I think of it as the need to invest in three areas: our kids, our workers, and our healthcare. And in each of those areas, communities of color face systemic barriers that hold them back in ways and make them less likely to achieve their full potential and to thrive and to be able to chart their own destiny, right? So we need to invest in our kids, because when we invest in our kids, when kids have more economic stability, when they go to good quality schools, when they have adequate nutrition, when those things happen, kids thrive and they can succeed. And so that's why I talk about expanding the child tax credit permanently to make it fully available to kids who need it most. It's why we need to invest in childcare so that families can work and kids get the help they need to develop. When we think about investing in workers, we know that in a dynamic economy, people lose jobs. But in the United States, a temporary job loss can be an absolute financial crisis for a family, because our unemployment insurance system creates so much financial insecurity for people. And the third thing I would say is healthcare. We have 2 million people in the United States, 2 million people who should be getting Medicaid coverage that provides comprehensive coverage, including mental health coverage, acute and long-term care. They should be getting Medicaid, and they aren't. And the reason is because their states, like the state of Georgia, has refused to adopt the Medicaid expansion. And that means that we have of that 2 million people, 60% are people of color, systematically left out of healthcare coverage that they need to be able to thrive and support their families. So we know what we can do. We know it can make a difference. And the question is whether we'll take those steps to get it done. Thank you.
Thank you. Gentleman's time has expired, and now recognize the gentleman from Mississippi, Mr. Kelly, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And naming an act something does not, naming a hearing something, saving lives in the United States economy. That's the name of this hearing. Since 2021, since this American Rescue Plan passed, more people died from COVID than did before. That's a fact. So it's not saving lives, or explain to me how it saved lives. So that is just a misnomer from the get. Our economy is not better today than it was in 2020. It is worse. And I know that because I think in the Army, I've spent a long time, and I'm trying to say this in a nice way. Don't pour water down my back and tell me it's raining. And my people in my district do not feel they're better off today. They do not feel like they're safer because of this American Rescue Plan. It's like scoring a touchdown in a college football game, which is, that's life where I live. You score a touchdown and you go up 7-0. And you celebrate the rest of the game, even though the final score is 63-7. Yes, the American Rescue Plan had some benefits when it first passed, but those benefits have long passed, and the actions and policies that we have done since then have added to inflation. We can tout the workforce. We can tout that unemployment is the lowest and all that. But here's what I know. I can't go to restaurants because they're closed because they can't find workers to do the job. I think right now we are tone deaf to the cries of the American people, especially those people in my district. We have $5 gas prices, record high, which happened long before the Putin invasion. I can point back to the 2020 budget where President Biden said in his budget that he intended to raise gas prices on the consumer. That is in his budget, not my word, his words. Record inflation. 8.6% last seen during the Carter administration. Supply chain issues that persist, the most recent, the baby formula, which we have taken steps way too late, not when we were notified of the problem in the administration, but months after they finally made an effort to do something, that a problem that they knew was coming. Grocery prices. Talk to your constituents or talk to your people. It is amazing what little foods you bring home in the plastic bags from a grocery store for spending more money than we did just months ago. It is appalling. My people cannot afford to eat and live. They have to make choices to feed their kids that they should not have to make. Input costs for our farmers continue to rise, whether that's diesel prices, whether that is fertilizer, tons of different input prices continue to rise, which guess what? Means a year from now that the cost of those groceries are going to go even higher. A workforce that is still disengaged because of us paying people not to work in this plan. Our service industry is especially impacted by this. And if you don't believe that, you can see the restaurants that close at lunch because they don't have enough employees to open up and serve a meal to people. A border crisis that there's been no attempt to solve. Under President Trump, we had an increasing average wage, and now wages are stagnant or decreasing at best, especially in light of celebrate? I think not. I think it's time to reduce gas prices. Mr. Moore, what things can we do? I don't really want to talk about the past, and I definitely am not celebrating. What things can we do to improve our economy now?
Well, Mr. Chairman, first of all, I don't recall all these supply chain problems when Trump was president. And it makes a big difference. I mean, look, Donald Trump, love him or hate him, I didn't always agree with his antics and some of the things he said, but he was a businessman. He knew how to make things work. He knew logistics. Who in this administration knows anything about business? I mean, Pete Buttigieg, Jennifer Granholm. If we're concerned about the supply chain, why would the first act of Joe Biden when he came into office was to kill a pipeline? Pipelines are critical to the supply chain, right? It's by far the most efficient way to transport our oil and gas. Why would we take millions of acres of prime oil and gas lands off of limits? Why would we do that? The International Energy Administration estimated that we would be right now at about 14 million barrels of oil a day if we had continued with the Trump policies. You know where we're at today? 11 million. So think about that. We've lost 3 million barrels of oil a day in production at $120 a barrel. You're talking about almost $500 million a day that the United States is losing in terms of our GDP. That's tragic. That's tragic. So we've got to end the war on American oil and gas. We're all for a clean environment, and we all want to deal with climate change, but shutting off American oil and gas was a really bad idea. I think we need to make the Trump tax cuts permanent. They were a success. I mean, everything shows that they were a success. We had the lowest poverty rate, the lowest unemployment rate. We had record revenues on the corporate and personal income tax. I mean, everything, you know, I helped design that plan, so I feel personally engaged with it. But all the claims that we made worked. And the other thing that's really critical that you just said, Mr. Kelly, one of the big mistakes that we made under Trump in the first year of COVID under Trump, and then accelerated under Biden, was increasing unemployment benefits. And if you look at our chart in my testimony on page 9, I don't know if you have it in front of you, we estimate that if we, instead of increasing unemployment benefits, which pays people not to work, if we had done what Trump wanted to do, which was cancel the payroll tax, we'd probably have about 4 million more Americans working today. 4 million more Americans. So let's incentivize people to work. Look, the heroes of the American economy in 2020 and 21 were the firefighters, the policemen, the delivery people, the nurses, the people who are working. Why didn't we reward them rather than the people who are not working? It just didn't make any sense.
Mr. Moore, my time's expired. I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Peters. No, I'm sorry, the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And what an amazing amount of delusional presentation that we have heard. And let me just quickly submit information into the record. The tax bill, the tax debacle of President Trump, at the time, it ignored the stagnation of working class wages and exacerbated inequality. In addition, it weakened revenues at a time when the nation needed to raise more revenues. It encouraged rampant tax gaming and risk, undermining the integrity of the tax code. In particular, down in Houston, where I represent, and I asked unanimous consent to submit a February 27, 2019 document into the record. How Trump's
without objection.
In addition, Trump's tax cuts accelerated gentrification and inequality in Houston. We also realized that after 2 years, the Trump tax cut failed to deliver on GOP promises. And of course, our own committee recognized that the tax law showers benefit on the wealthy, large corporations, while abandoning the middle class and the Main Street businesses. We would not have survived. The American Rescue Plan provided $8.2 million in American Rescue Plan dollars towards the Texas healthcare workforce, the very point that the gentleman just previously made. I am not going to sit here and tolerate a lopsided presentation that suggests that we would have been in nirvana if we had had the previous president here. We would have had 3 million dead Americans because we would not have had the distribution of the vaccines and or the testing. As a member of the United States Congress, I did about 85 testing sites and another 80 vaccination sites with local health collaborators. Right now, we're stuck. Why are we stuck? Because the bill that we passed in the House on COVID testing is languishing in the Republican strangled Senate, even though Democrats want to do it. I believe that we should recognize that we can work together. We need to work together on improving the supply chains. We need to work together on dealing with the question of inflation. But I can assure you that if Joe Biden had not been elected and the previous person had been elected, now promoting the big lie, we would have been in an enormous disaster. More people would have died. The monies to move the distribution of the vaccines and the testing protocol would not have worked. And families would have been in the streets carrying their belongings, as we saw in Houston before those dollars came, with whole families taking baby carriages out. This is an outrage that anyone would want to characterize the American Rescue Plan as anything but a rescue plan. That's what it was. It was a rescue plan. Mayor Vince Williams, I was a board member of the National League of Cities. Let's hear you pound the table. Tell me what a lifeline, very quickly, because I want to get another question in, that American Rescue Plan was for your cities that you represent.
Thank you, Representative. I appreciate that. I do want folks to understand that when we think about a lifeline for America's people, you know, this is about people over politics. And we've got to make sure, and you just made the comment about working together. This is about everyday Americans, and it doesn't matter what district you're representing. There are people hurting in all of our districts and communities. But, you know, I do want to touch on, you know, how the American Rescue Plan further moved racial equity, if you will. You know, my statement and my written testimony includes a focus on the social determinants of health. Life expectancy is shaped by many factors beyond an individual's control. And that's what we're talking about. Those things that we can help people with where they have no ability to control it. And that's health disparities, access to internet, access to food insecurities. Those are things we've got to focus on. And we're really having a discussion about some partisan differences that, look, I wasn't brought here for this. I was brought here to talk about how ARPA assisted America's cities, towns, and villages across this nation. And my main focus is about the people who have been hurting, the people who have died as well. And certainly, I've mentioned in my commentary that our first responders were our heroes, certainly the nurses in our community. But when we talk about healthcare, my city doesn't have a hospital. We have 2 urgent care facilities, you know, so certainly hospital opportunities are needed.
Parrott, if I might.
Yes.
Question. Thank you, Mayor, very much. On
Thank
what
you.
The American Rescue Plan had on poverty, and if you can just restate the value of the child tax credit in my waning moments. Mr. Chairman, if she can answer that question. Ms. Parrott?
She may answer.
Okay. Over the last 80 years or more, it might be difficult to think of a single piece of pre-pandemic legislation that's been more effective than the rescue plan at preventing poverty. Final poverty figures are not available for 2021 yet, but researchers know enough about the rescue plan to say several things. First, the American Rescue Plan kept a huge number of people above the poverty line in 2021, more than 12 million people, according to projections by Columbia University. This includes 5.6 million children, compared to what poverty would have been without that legislation. The study found that the rescue plan overall lowered poverty by nearly 1/3 and by more than half for children, compared again to where poverty would have been without the plan. A second study by the Urban Institute found larger reductions in poverty. These and other projections suggest the rescue plan may prove to be the single most effective law since 1935 for protecting people from poverty and hardship in a given year. But as I stated earlier, temporary measures help us see what's possible, but can't solve a long-term underlying problem. A key feature of the American Rescue Plan was making the full child tax credit available to the lowest income children. That has enormous positive effects on children, can lower poverty, and improve their future trajectories. Thank you.
Thank you. A gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, Mr. Moore, you keep bashing California's socialist economy, but I need to remind you that despite its problems, California is still one of the best places in the country to build a successful small business. All you have to do is start with a successful large business. Mr. Chairman, there are times when I wonder if the majority is completely disconnected from reality. The American Rescue Plan that spent and printed nearly $2 trillion that we didn't have, that amounts to about $15,000 for every family in America, unleashed a wicked inflation that's now robbing families of thousands of dollars of their earnings. It turns out that all that free money that you sent out is pretty expensive. And Americans are paying it back every day at the grocery store, the gas station, the rents they pay everywhere. Government can't put a dollar into the economy without first taking that same dollar out of the economy. Whenever government gives you a dollar, it has to take a dollar from you. It does so through current taxes, which rob you of your current earning power and suppresses productivity. It does so through your future taxes by borrowing, which robs you of your future earnings, and it does so through inflation, which ravages your savings and purchasing power. ARPA was financed through inflation, and it is crushing working families. And at the same time, you keep flooding the labor market with cheap illegal labor, assuring working Americans will never recover. And the sad irony is they trusted you. Even your own economists warned you this would happen, Steve Ratner and Larry Summers, among others. And yet you listened to the socialists in your party instead, and this is what we've got. Before you passed ARPA, the CBO projected 2% inflation for 2022. We're now at 8.6% and accelerating. It projected 0 interest rate increases until 2024. We've had 1.25 so far, as much as 2 when the dust settles at the Fed, and mortgage rates have doubled. CBO projected 4.6% economic growth for 2021, 3% for 2022. Instead, we've had a 1.5% economic shrinkage in the first quarter. And you have the gall to tell us that ARPA is doing great things for the economy and everybody's wonderful. Are you out of your minds? I keep trying to warn you, you cannot spin the economy. Everybody knows precisely how they're doing. And when you try to tell them otherwise, you sound foolish. And when you keep trying, you sound delusional. You're not fooling anybody but yourselves. Now, Mr. Moore, we just heard about poverty. Didn't we reach the lowest poverty rate in 60 years under the Trump administration?
Recorded history of the United States.
How did communities of color fare in the Trump economy?
So we had the lowest Hispanic, Asian, and Black poverty rate ever recorded in the history of the United States.
How about wage growth?
Pardon me?
How about wage growth?
Very strong. I mean, we had, according to the Census Bureau data does kind of the critical research on this, and they found over the 4 years of Trump administration, roughly $6,000 after inflation real income gain for the median income. And that's the people just in the middle.
That was the fastest wage growth in 40 years, was it not?
Roughly, yep.
And
wage growth was pretty good
in the principal beneficiaries, working class Americans, wasn't the income gap between rich and poor finally beginning to shrink?
So this is really the most important point. I think we'd all agree on this panel that one way that you should assess a government policy is how it affects the least among us. And I think I agree with that. How does it affect minorities? How does it affect the lowest income people? So if we accept that criteria, we saw big gains for low-income people under Trump. And here's the thing the reason I said inflation is the cruel.
What are we seeing now, and how are communities of color doing now?
Well, see, this is the thing. When I said inflation is the cruelest tax, it is the most regressive tax of all. Look, if you have 8% inflation, I guarantee you Bill Gates doesn't care. I guarantee you someone who's making more than $1 million doesn't care. But people are making $50,000, they get crushed.
If they're making $50,000, doesn't an 8.6% inflation rate mean they've just lost $4,300 of purchasing power?
Well, wages are up by 5. So
yeah, but if at $50,000, an 8.6% inflation rate means reduced wages of purchasing power for $4,300, is it not? If I set aside $100,000 toward my retirement, doesn't that mean that the Democrats' inflation just took $8,600 of purchasing power?
Well, except the wages are up by 5%. But you know what's really down, sir, is savings. I don't understand why Joe Biden keeps saying savings is up. We've seen $11 trillion lost in the stock market in the last 4 months. Where do people have their savings? So this is the biggest evaporation of savings since
if you've got $100,000 in your savings account that you put towards your retirement, isn't it worth now $8,600 less this year because of the Democrats' inflation?
Yes.
Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired, and now recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Peters, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In San Diego, the American Rescue Plan has been a lifeline for my constituents. Federal funding has flowed to San Diego families, students, hospitals, small businesses, restaurants, and communities that were facing disaster at the beginning of this pandemic. Since the day the American Rescue Plan became law, the number of San Diegans who are vaccinated has grown 5 times. More than 75% of the county is now fully vaccinated. I'm proud that $95 million of relief went to live venues and almost 17,000 PPP loans granted to small businesses in my district. Our team has connected dozens of small business owners with the Small Business Administration to secure shuttered venues operators grants, restaurant relief grants, paycheck protection loans, like Mr. Lamb in Rancho Bernardo, whose salon received a $79,000 PPP. Mr. Buono from Little Italy, whose family restaurant received a $124,000 PPP loan. We've also dispersed over $200 million to more than 10,000 renters to cover unpaid rent and utility bills. The fact is that these have been great benefits and kept us out of much worse problems. And that was what we were trying to do at the beginning. I'd like to ask Dr. Coronado about the claim that we have exported inflation. Would you respond to that notion? I don't know how, by the way, I don't know how that would have affected the supply of chips and the demand for goods, but tell me what the response to that is.
Right. I think it's fair to say that, yes, when American consumers spend, it supports the global economy, but it's very difficult to tie any of that directly to the inflation we've seen. One of the things we saw here and abroad was a shift to good spending that was after, we've seen declining good spending in advanced economies since World War II. We've become ever more service-oriented economies. And in fact, so much so that the infrastructure of supply chains was underinvested in. And I think when we suddenly shifted back to good spending, both here and in Europe and in Canada and in Australia, it strained these global supply chains. And that's been revealed as a really fundamental structural problem that bears some focus and some investment, and that will help increase efficiency globally. What we want when we run into supply chain constraints like these supply chain issues we're facing is that we invest in them and come out of this with better efficiency and better productivity. So I think what we're seeing is very isolated, focused inflation in areas that are most impacted by the supply chains. That's a global phenomenon. And then there are differences across countries depending on structures, and the other universal reality is the food and energy price inflation that we see.
I mean, it's pretty preposterous to suggest that Ukraine had nothing to do with that, or that this was not driven in large part by outside events related to COVID.
Yeah.
One of the other benefits, I think, and maybe Dr. Coronado and Ms. Parrott could speak to this, was we put in place temporary protection from evictions. I agree this should be temporary, and we should get back to business as normal. But can you describe the economic benefit of keeping people in their homes through this pandemic as we climb out of it?
Yeah, absolutely. There's so many I'll just speak briefly and then turn it over to Ms. Parrott. There's so many interlinkages between the benefits that were provided. Keeping people in their homes during a pandemic and allowing them to pay the rent also meant that they were better able to feed their families, which reduced distress. It meant that they were more able to continue working and continue to earn income. And it meant that they were also more able to pay their other financial responsibilities. So again, one of the points I made in my testimony is we have record low delinquencies on all kinds of loan categories. We've seen record low repossessions of cars. These are meaningful benefits to working class families. So the spillover, and I think one of the innovations of this, the stimulus that we provided and the fiscal support that we provided is just giving people the money to make the decisions they need to make for their families. So you mentioned the rental assistance, that was important. And then you also had cash on hand to do what you needed to do depending on the needs of your family. And it just provided so many spillovers.
We're going to run out of time, but I just wanted to address the notion that we didn't help the poorest people. The child tax credit cut childhood poverty in half. That should be extended. Also, the notion that the answer to this problem is to extend the Trump tax cuts. Trump tax cuts are in place today. This had nothing to do with those as well. So thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Smucker, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a few comments, and if I can submit a letter into the record, I would appreciate it.
Without objection.
This is a letter, Mr. Chairman, to you that I sent to you after a previous hearing
when we talked about the need for a hearing on inflation. And I still stand, I think, diving into what caused this inflation and what we in Congress can do to combat that is a really good discussion to have. I know we've had some of that here today, but I'd like to see us do that further. So that letter remains. It's interesting to hear the chairman's take on this, talks about 2% wage increase, but completely ignores, almost ignores the real wage decrease that we've seen. And Democrats know that this economy is not working for the American people. That's why their dais has been empty most of this hearing. It is difficult for them to defend what is happening in the economy. Mayor Williams, I appreciate you being here. Thank you for what you're doing in your community. You're working to help to see that the needs of your constituents are met. I want you to know that you're not the only one in the room that is in that position. We all come here to Congress to work. I ran for Congress to help to ensure that the poorest among us can live their own American dream. And this is a real discussion about policies that make that happen or will prevent that from happening. So yes, maybe sometimes it's political, but I want you to know that I think every member on this dais agrees with you that we should have policies that work. The inflation in your community, does that affect your constituents?
Yes, it does.
If the gas prices, I'm sure do. If we agreed that the American Rescue Plan caused that, would it have been worth it?
Yes, it would have been worth it.
I can tell you that my constituents don't believe that. Yeah. I don't know about yours, but mine do not. Yeah. They would prefer to have an economy that is growing, an economy like you had before the pandemic when you said Union City was trending in the right direction by nearly every measure. That was not by accident. That was a result of work that you've done and of work that had been done on the federal level that helped to ensure that we had policies in place that allowed every community to benefit. So these are important issues that we're talking about. Mr. Moore, appreciate your testimony. I think we need a better understanding of what causes inflation, and maybe I want to get back to the basics. And the testimony of, Coronado, Dr. Coronado, she said U.S. core inflation rose earlier and higher than other advanced economies after inflation rose. This is her direct quote. U.S. core inflation rose earlier and higher than other advanced economies. I have a chart that shows that. This is before Ukraine because there are obviously supply chain issues, Ukraine issues that do have an impact, but this was before that occurred. This is OECD countries, so countries comparable to the U.S. The red is their inflation rate. And look how the U.S. Inflation rate jumped just after the American Rescue Plan. Can you tell me, Mr. Moore, how do governments cause inflation? What causes inflation?
Well, if you just hold up, can you hold up that chart one more time? Because it's remarkable. Look at the end of 2020. Look at where the inflation rate just goes straight up under Biden. We had 1.4% inflation the month Trump left office. So that's a pretty remarkable malfeasance. We hadn't had, Mr. Smucker, inflation for about 35 years in this country. One of the reasons the U.S. did so well through the 80s, 90s, 2000s, and 2010s was we had very low inflation. Our inflation rate ranged from 2 to 3, maybe sometimes it would hit 4%, but we were in the sweet zone. And what you want from monetary policy is very simple. You want a strong and stable currency. And by the way, just as an aside, I'm very concerned about this idea that the Federal Reserve Board is going to get involved in, climate change issues and race issues and so on. No, the Federal Reserve has to hold inflation down. Stop.
Well, and I'm sorry I'm out of time. I'd love to ask you some more questions, but what I'm concerned about is the impact on the communities of Mayor Williams and other communities across the country of inflation that is not tailing off, that the Fed is going to have a very difficult time dealing with that without causing a severe recession. So we have hard times ahead as a direct result of policies that have been put in place by this administration.
Mr. Smucker, I believe in the first 2 years of the Biden administration, if we stay on the course we're on, we'll see all of the median income gains that happened under Trump completely eliminated.
I'm out of time. Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. Now recognize the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Moulton, for 5 minutes. Is he on?
Dr. Burgess.
Go, okay.
Burgess.
All right, we don't, Mr. Moulton? No. Okay, we can't find Mr. Moulton. Now yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Nevada, Mr. Horsford.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing, and thank you to our esteemed witnesses for appearing before the committee. I'm actually glad that we have your expertise and insight to highlight just how fundamental the American Rescue Plan has been to our country's pandemic recovery. When my constituents sent me here to Congress, they expected me to deliver results. They sent me here with the dual mission this past 2 years of crushing the COVID pandemic and implementing an equitable recovery for working Americans. So I'm proud to say that I voted to pass the American Rescue Plan in the moment that it was needed. Not one of my colleagues, my Republican colleagues on the other side, voted for that bill. What was their plan? To crush the pandemic. What was their plan? To help small businesses and entrepreneurs. What was their plan to help lift 50% of families out of poverty through the child tax credit? And what was their plan to help state and local governments who have been at the forefront of providing the response to crush the virus and to help with our economic recovery? When I talk to my mayors in my local governments, they tell me they use that money for what? Public safety. The only ones to defund law enforcement were the Republicans who voted no on the American Rescue Plan. That's the facts. Now, I didn't come here to defend every program. That's not what I came to Congress to do. I came to make sure that the federal programs that Congress approves and that the administration implements works for my constituents. And there are areas that need to be improved. But when you don't even have a plan to address how you would crush the pandemic or ensure economic recovery that's equitable, I think that's a major problem. Now, by supporting America's entrepreneurs, the American Rescue Plan ensured that our country would be ready to grow when COVID was finally crushed. Would you agree, Dr. Coronado, that the American Rescue Plan positioned our economy on the path for growth by mitigating the worst impacts of the pandemic? And could you please speak to how aggressive fiscal policy may have lessened the long-term scarring effects we often see after severe downturns?
Yes, undeniably, the American Rescue Plan and the fiscal support helped the economy recover even through the pandemic, and now more as we move beyond it into the endemic phase. And I think that you're putting your finger on the most important aspect, which is the support to the labor market and getting people back to work when they are able and ready to do so. It did take, we did lose participation. And now that is roaring back. It's roaring back. And that is because people now are able and ready, and they are actually able to come in and command higher wages and better situations, more full-time work. So there's a lot of things about the labor market that you highlight that, last recovery, we didn't do that. And people were out of the labor force for years, many years. We didn't see that recovery happen until 7 years into the expansion.
And it's disproportionately on women and people of color, which
Absolutely.
I think also speaks to where's your plan to help with an equitable recovery for every community. Now, one of the challenges that I continue to hear from in people in my district is the cost of living, affordable housing, with the cost of rent on the rise. People do still need help, and that's why I applaud my home state of Nevada for allocating funding from the American Rescue Plan, which will now invest $500 million directly into affordable housing. Now, those solutions can take many different forms, but Mayor Williams, will you please discuss the many ways in which municipalities have used ARP funding to help constituents with essentials, such as keeping food on the table or a roof over their head?
Yes, sir, and thank you for that question. That was something that was so important to my community. Certainly, we had people who were at risk of evictions. We certainly used the funding to be able to stave those evictions off by helping with rental assistance, as well as mortgage assistance and utility assistance, something as meaningful as being able to have your water service. Those are the things that we focused on, but also assisting folks with being able to have money to go to the grocery store. Those were some of the things we have been dealing with. And now this issue around access to internet, that was a big one in my community because, you know, many of my families had to drive their kids to the local McDonald's to sit on the parking lot to be able to receive access to Wi-Fi. Those were things we were focusing on to make sure that we assisted families to be able to pay for their internet bill if they had a service. But, you know, thanks to this affordable high-speed internet service that's coming, many families will receive that. But the everyday support, but the everyday need to keep families alive, those were the things we were focusing on in our communities.
Well, thank you for focusing on the American people. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Now recognize the gentleman from Texas, Dr. Burgess, for 5 minutes.
I thank the chairman. I do feel the necessity in answering a couple of the questions that were just asked by my colleague from Nevada. If you'll recall, March 21st of 2020, this Congress passed the CARES Act, the biggest single bill that I have ever seen in my tenure in Congress. It was well north of $1 trillion. It was right at the beginning of the pandemic. It was thought it was necessary to be able to withstand some of the blows that we were in line to receive from this terrible disease that was visited upon us by another country. But the damaging thing was not so much in just spending the money. I'll still argue that the money was necessary. The damaging thing was we never went back and sort of looked at what was necessary. For example, I'm a physician. We put $150 billion in the Provider Relief Fund, arguably a good thing. But we really didn't know what the dollar figure was to put into the Provider Relief Fund. We had no organized plan. I'm also on the Energy and Commerce Committee. We're the major authorizing committee for healthcare expenditures. We never once had a hearing, a single hearing before or after passing that $1.1 trillion bill. We never had a single hearing of what was actually necessary to help our healthcare sector who'd been delivered this terrible blow by the coronavirus. And as a consequence, we had funds that were unspent that were probably necessary somewhere else. And then in December, we'd come back and add more money on top of that. So I would simply argue that Mr. Moore, I think, has pointed out that by June of 2020, things were starting to stabilize. And our CBO director, Mr. Swagel, has told us that the economy going into the coronavirus, and I think, Mr. Mayor, you've kind of underscored this. Going into the coronavirus, the economy was actually doing pretty darn well. As Jack Kemp taught us, the rising tide was lifting all boats. Then we were delivered this terrible blow. But honestly, to never go back and look at what we did, what was necessary, if more is necessary, we can have that discussion. But then here's the real damaging thing. We get to February of 2021 and we pass a $1.9 trillion bill that is entirely partisan. It's passed under reconciliation, guaranteed that we're not going to have.
Will the gentleman yield?
No, I will not. You can get your chairman to yield too. I'm sure he will. Guaranteed that it was going to be a partisan exercise and that no voices on the Republican side would be heard. And yet you can see just by the attendance here today in this hearing, yeah, on the Republican side, we're terribly interested in what this bill was going to do and what this bill did do. And here's the other part of the problem. When you pass that bill in February of 2021, right, you're not a prognosticator. You don't know what's going to happen in August But what if you have the most humiliating defeat that the United States has ever encountered in the country of Afghanistan, and the leader absconds with all the money? And then, because we all know from President Reagan that weakness is provocative, and then you see the invasion of Ukraine, which anybody could have predicted because the Russian army was aggregated around the borders. What did you think was going to happen? So what was your plan for this? Well, turns out there was no plan. We were told by the same geniuses who couldn't predict Afghanistan, we were told by those same folks that Ukraine would fall in 3 days. 3 days, Kiev would be under the control of the Russians. Completely underestimating the fact that Ukrainians have shown in the past and shown again repetitively that they are willing to fight for their own homeland. So look, forgive me if I am skeptical about some of the discourse that we've heard here this morning. It almost sounds like we're stuck in a Charles Dickens novel. It's the best of times, it's the worst of times. But Mr. Moore, let me just give you the last word here. You've been through all this. You saw it from the inside of the administration. You saw what was going to happen. You're bound to have had misgivings as you saw what this committee was going to do in February of last year.
Well, let me just give you one example of the kind of crazy spending priorities in this bill. So we spent more money under the American Recovery Act on subsidizing the New York subway system than we did on therapies and treatments. I mean, how lunatic is that, really? I mean, we talk about a misallocation of resources. I urge all of the members of this panel, we spent $1.9 trillion. There was a front page story in the New York Times about 3 or 4 weeks ago, 140 billion, not 140 million, 140 billion was ripped off from the unemployment benefit program. That didn't stimulate the American economy. It stimulated economies in Africa and South America. Half of the fraudsters didn't even live in the United States. So can we please do a thorough investigation of what happened in the Medicaid funding, unemployment insurance program, the food stamp program, you mentioned the rental assistance program. The fraud rates were 20% in a lot of these programs. A private sector program is about a 2% fraud rate. We cannot allow that to persist.
We cannot allow. Thank you, Mr. Moore. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. And now recognize the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Moulton, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to point out that in any piece of legislation, there are going to be problems. There are going to be fraud. There's going to be fraud that needs to be investigated. But let's not lose the bigger picture here. Representative Smucker, my colleague who just spoke, saw Lancaster, a city in his district and his hometown, receive more than $36 million from the ARP to prevent layoffs, to boost the local economy. Dr. Burgess's district received more than $52 million in ARPA dollars. In fact, Ranking Member Smith, Missouri received nearly $1 billion. Now, all of you have gone and talked about the investments that you have made all over the country. In fact, it's amazing that Republicans all across America can't seem to stop promoting the benefits of the American Rescue Plan that they continue to oppose. In my home district in Lynn, Massachusetts, the largest city, they've been able to make a generational investment to improve the quality of the lives for residents through affordable housing, food security, entrepreneurship, small business assistance, workforce development, including childcare and digital access, mental and behavioral health, so critical in this pandemic, and environmental investments in infrastructure as well. Mayor Williams, could you just talk briefly about your city's experience with the pandemic and what would have been the impact to your city's local economy if not for the American Rescue Plan?
Thank you, sir. The economy in my city would have certainly continued to do as many communities have, and that is collapse. I do have to say the city of Union City was one of the highest in the metro Atlanta area as it relates to COVID. We had some of the highest case rates, and that's not something to be proud of. We are a municipality of less than 30,000 individuals, but we were always at the top when it came to COVID cases, but also making sure that our individuals in our community had access to health care. You know, the biggest problem we had was getting people tested, getting people to physicians or hospitals that could treat them. You know, so those have been some of the biggest challenges we had during the COVID, the early stages of COVID. Thank you.
No, thank you very much. And let me just say that just because many of my Republican colleagues are hypocritical here about this rescue plan and the investments that's been able to make in their communities as well, it doesn't mean that they're all wrong. I will agree as a Democrat that the ARP has impacted the current inflation rate, but it's also important to understand the broader context globally, as well as the recession that we would have likely faced if not for this legislation. I mean, inflation has been happening across the world, primarily from pandemic disruptions, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I mean, even before the ARP passed, as Mark Goldwine on the Committee for Responsible Budget noted, the seeds for a high inflation environment were already planted, end quote. Right now, we're experiencing inflation with low unemployment and high growth. And if not for global issues such as the invasion of Ukraine, we wouldn't be seeing negative wage growth. Dr. Coronado, is the American Rescue Plan responsible for the 8.1% inflation rate in Europe?
Sorry, it's certainly worth, not the majority, not even close to the majority of the inflation we're seeing right now.
Okay, is the ARP responsible for the oil prices set on the international market, for the price of oil, which is set internationally?
No, clearly not, or the food prices.
Isn't it true that if the ARP wasn't enacted, we would likely have entered into a global economic recession with serious ramifications, or a recession for America with serious ramifications for the global economy?
We were still in a very precarious situation, yes. We had started to see positive economic growth in the US, but the global recovery was far more fragile and remains more fragile. And yes, without the fiscal support, especially in light of the repeated waves of COVID that were stressing communities and public health.
US growth is set to surpass China for the first time since 1976. Forecasts suggest US GDP will grow by 2.8% this year, compared with just 2% in China. Dr. Coronado, did we see this during the Trump or even the Reagan administrations, US growth higher than China?
No, we did not.
I see that real quick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentlewoman from Colorado, Ms. Boebert, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you to the witnesses who showed up. I would have loved to have seen some members from the Biden administration, from the executive here today to speak on this. But today, the House Budget Committee will be playing along with Speaker Pelosi's con game of titling a bill something magnificent and then loading it with a bunch of liberal wish list items and then claiming success on that legislation. And, it'd probably actually be a yes vote on a lot more legislation that we see in the House of Representatives if the language in the bill actually matched the title. It has been just over a year since Joe Biden signed the $2 trillion so-called American Rescue Plan into law that incentivizes lockdowns, paid workers to stay home, gave stimulus checks to government employees who are at no risk of losing their jobs, and really fueled the fire of inflation, this crisis that American families are now paying the price for. American families are paying the price for bad policy. And this chart that I have here, it shows exactly what that bill did for the cost of goods and services. You see that there? You cannot force millions of Americans out of the workforce and then allow them to go back to work and call that job creation. You cannot treat the American people like your own personal slush fund. It's been said before, but one day you'll run out of other people's money to spend. Since the passage of this blue state bailout, the Biden White House has claimed that, quote, the economy is in a better place than it has been historically. Well, I'm curious. Is it the highest inflation of my lifetime, the highest gas prices in American history, or a shrinking GDP that would cause Jen Psaki's replacement to make such an outrageous claim? Under President Trump, which I'd like to pause and just say happy birthday to my all-time favorite president, but gas prices were less than half of what they are today. GDP had positive growth, and moms and dad had formula to feed their babies. I miss, and the American people miss, the Trump economy. Not only was the so-called American Rescue Plan entirely unnecessary, but it was riddled with swampy deals for Biden's political allies in blue states and did not include common sense protections to mitigate fraud. Less than 9% of this $2 trillion sham went to anything COVID related. Now, the average American family is paying the price for these failed policies. And that price is $5,200 per year. Heck, if you're a senior living on fixed income, Joe Biden's economy, it's a death sentence. And Mr. Moore, I have a question for you, if you don't mind. With just a brief answer, if you were advising Joe Biden on how to make our economy as weak as possible, what would you tell him to change?
Wait, I'm sorry, to make it as strong as possible?
As weak. If you were advising him, make America's economy weak, what would you have him change?
Well, I do pretty much what we've done. I mean, this idea that somehow we're in a recovery right now, I just looked at the numbers, the latest numbers for the GDP forecast for the second quarter. Those are 0.9%. We had negative 1.5% in the first quarter. So if you put those numbers together, for the first half of 2021, we've had negative growth. What recovery are you all talking about? There is no recovery in the economy. We're negative. We're negative for the first half of the year after spending $1.9 trillion.
Yes, Mr. Moore, thank you so much for laying that out. I would love to give a copy of Trumponomics to everyone here on the Budget Committee. I think that would be something that everyone would
I've got
really
copies
benefit.
available.
There you go. We'll get you some signed copies over there. Mr. Mayor Vince Williams, can you please tell me what bird sanctuaries, a beachside 800-room luxury hotel, pickleball courts, ski resorts, and Halloween festivals have in common?
I have no idea. I don't have either of those in my city.
Well, your city is paying for them, Mr. Williams. Mayor Williams, each of these non-COVID health-related projects was paid for by state and local governments with COVID-19 aid. Washington politicians are addicted to spending. We don't have a revenue problem. We have a spending problem. And this addiction, like the American Rescue Plan is causing, is similar to Parmesan cheese and Hunter Biden. Thanks, and I yield back.
Gentlewoman's time has expired. And now recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Jeffries, for 5 minutes.
I thank the distinguished chair of the Budget Committee. To the extent that there is a public policy problem in Washington, D.C., Exhibit A was the GOP tax scam. That is the Republican singular signature piece of legislative accomplishment relative to the economy that occurred during the prior administration. 83% of the benefits went to the wealthiest 1%, saddling our country with approximately $2 trillion worth of unnecessary debt simply to subsidize the lifestyles of the rich and shameless. That is problematic economics. I'm thankful that we have a president who leaned in to lifting up the economy for everyday Americans, beginning with the American Rescue Plan. A few questions for you, Dr. Coronado. Thank you for your presence here. I thank all of the witnesses for testifying here today. The unemployment rate in January of 2021, when President Biden left office, was approximately 6.3%. Is that correct?
That's right.
And today, with the American Rescue Plan in effect, under President Biden's leadership, the unemployment rate has dropped to 3.6%. Is that correct?
That's where it is, yes.
And that means that millions of Americans are actually back to work, being able to provide for their families. Is that correct?
That's right. We've been creating millions of jobs a year.
And approximately how many jobs have actually been created since President Biden came into office in January of 2021?
Ooh, I don't have that number, but it's several million.
Yeah, I believe the number is 8.7 million jobs.
Yes,
since
that sounds about
President Biden
right.
came into office, and that is a record in American presidential
That is a
history
record.
for a similar period of time. That is a significant development, and that is meaningful progress for the American people. Is it fair to say that the American Rescue Plan was able to head off a wave of evictions as well as a foreclosure crisis that could have devastated American families all across this country?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Now, the American Rescue Plan, which was a necessary intervention at a time when the economy was on the brink of collapse, absent that level of intervention, what are the possibilities? There are some economists who expressed grave concerns that at the time we could lapse into perhaps a great recession. Was that a reasonable concern at the time, absent the type of intervention that occurred relative to the American Rescue Plan?
Yeah, I mean, we were in the deepest recession since the Great Depression during the middle of the pandemic. And had we not provided the various waves of fiscal support, we would not have had a quick recovery. In fact, most economists of all institutions and of all stripes were expecting a very prolonged and painful and difficult recovery before that fiscal support was provided. And you would have had a lot more lasting disconnect from the labor force, more failures of businesses, more people losing their homes, much as we saw immediately after the housing crash and the Great Recession. A lot of the thinking was that the recovery would look like that, and that was very halting and slow. And the main difference is the fiscal approach that was taken during this episode, that to err on the side of supporting people, giving them both targeted interventions like rent support and health support, as well as just cash to determine what they needed to spend that cash on, has led to a variety of benefits, including best credit, best wage gains, best credit scores, best wage gains for lower income households that we've ever seen.
Well, thank you. And certainly there are issues that we need to continue to work on, and we're doing that as Democrats in terms of lowering costs for everyday Americans. But the American Rescue Plan was absolutely necessary and decisive in trying to put us into a better space, both on the economic side and as it relates to the public health crisis. Less than 2 million Americans fully vaccinated when President Biden took office. Now there are more than 225 million Americans fully vaccinated, giving us the opportunity to march toward normalcy. I thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank the witnesses for their presence, and I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired, and now recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Good, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Moore, I don't think you can potentially overestimate how important your presence is here today to try to educate the Democrat majority on basic economics, basic budget principles. Just to refer to something that was said by the previous speaker, you cannot give tax cuts to those who don't pay taxes. That, of course, would be welfare. Basically, you're paying people beyond what they earn, because it was said, hey, the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, most of the benefits were to higher income earners. Speaking of revenues from the tax cuts, what was the impact from the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act on what happened to tax revenues when tax rates were reduced? What happened to overall revenues?
So one of it's important for people to understand exactly what we did, because I helped design that with Larry Kudlow and Art Laffer, and obviously Trump was heavily engaged in this. But the whole idea was we had the highest business taxes in the world. That just doesn't make America competitive. We all want to create jobs, right? The United States having a business tax rate that was in some cases 20 percentage points higher than all the countries we're competing with. As I used to say to Donald Trump, that's a Head Start program for every program we're competing with. So we brought that rate down from virtually the highest in the world. By the way, think about that. 5 years ago, the United States had the highest business tax rate in the world, and we cut it to below the average. And we saw enormous gains, as I mentioned, lowest unemployment rate, lowest poverty rate for every group. The idea that 83% of the benefits went to the top 1% is just fallacious. We saw gains throughout the economy. And there was just a piece in the Wall Street Journal about 2 weeks ago, sir, I'll get that for the record, that showed, lo and behold, guess what's happened to corporate tax receipts in the last 2 years? They've gone way up. So there was, and I didn't even expect this. I thought we'd see a revenue loss, but I just thought it would be good for the economy. But we actually saw a gain in corporate tax revenues, even though we lowered the rates. Pretty
Wonderful
amazing
job, and thank you for confirming that. I submit that the majority party here, if you could demonstrate that cutting taxes on higher income earners would grow the pie, increase revenue for the government could do more things, they would be against it just because they don't think it's right to cut taxes for people who make too much and because they believe that it's unfair, if you will. It's incredible, frankly, that the Dem majority would hold a hearing to defend the ARP, the American so-called Rescue Plan, and their disastrous economic policies. Democrats have two choices. They can admit failure, apologize and change course, or they can do what they're doing, which is double down, lie about the impact of their spending programs, their economic programs, and try to fool the American people. As we know, less than 9% of the massive $2 trillion in the ARP was actually directed to combat the China virus. The rest of it was wasted. That's what the federal government does best, of course, and it actually increased inflation, decreased job growth, increased welfare and dependency, of course, massively increased the deficit. Can you point to, do you think that, and I know you feel like you're on repeat, but repetition is the key to learning. Hopefully the other side is listening to this. Can you point to how the ARP has helped or hindered the job recovery over the last year? It's amazing. They crush the economy. They eliminate more jobs. They make it impossible for employers to operate their businesses, for people to go to work. They fire workers for not getting a vaccine. So they crush the economy, eliminate millions of jobs like it's never happened in the history of the country. And now they want credit because they say they created jobs. Federal government didn't create any jobs. All they can do is create an environment, as you did during the Trump administration, that facilitates or allows businesses to do that. But do you think that the American Rescue Plan helped or hindered America's job recovery over the last year? The ARP itself, did it help or hinder the job recovery over the last year?
Sorry, is that for me?
That's to you, yes, sir.
If you look at figure 5 in my testimony, this is really important about what happened with the American economy. Starting in late 2020, the red states opened up their economies. They didn't need any fiscal help. They opened up their businesses. They opened the restaurants, their stores, their churches, their playgrounds, their blah, blah, blah. There were no negative health effects to that. And if you look at this chart, you see the 10 states, there's now roughly 10 states, sir, that are actually above the employment level they had before pandemic. Guess what? Every single one of them is a red state that opened up their economy. I'll read you. Utah, Idaho, Montana, Texas, Florida, North Carolina, Georgia, Tennessee, Arizona, Arkansas, South Dakota. There's one actually blue state, Colorado. They handled it pretty well. Look at the states at the bottom. New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania. These states kept their economy. The way we should have stimulated the economy was by getting these blue states to open up their businesses. They refused to do it, and that's why they needed trillions of dollars from the federal government.
The Democrats' policies did not crush the virus. They crushed the economy. And the state with the highest per average age in the country, Florida, was aggressive in opening up. That's and of exactly course, right. We did not have a negative impact on Florida in terms of the China virus.
That's exactly
impact.
right.
So thank you, Mr. Moore.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Chu, for 5 minutes.
Ms. Parrott, as a member of the Ways and Means Committee, I want to draw attention to something we worked on as an aspect of the American Rescue Plan that made a considerable impact on the lives of working Americans. The American Rescue Plan increased affordability of health coverage, enhancing the advanced premium tax credit for the ACA plans. And this ensured that working families could continue to access health insurance throughout the pandemic, and included eliminating the so-called cliff that families who made just over the subsidy cutoff, which is $111,000 per year for a family of 4. Can you talk about the impact of these affordability measures? And with these important tax credits set to expire at the end of this year, Could you discuss who would be most likely to see their monthly premiums go up?
Yes, thanks so much for the question. The rescue plan reduced or eliminated premium costs for most marketplace enrollees and helped spur record marketplace enrollment. If these enhancements are not extended, the large majority of the 14.5 million people who signed up for marketplace coverage this year will either lose coverage or pay significantly more in premiums in 2023. According to estimates by both the Urban Institute and HHS, about 3 million people would lose coverage and become uninsured. Over 10 million additional people would remain insured but see their premium subsidies reduced or eliminated entirely, according to HHS estimates. These premium cost increase would make coverage much less affordable at a time when people are struggling with increased costs for food, housing, and other basics. For example, the Urban Institute estimates that subsidized marketplace enrollees with incomes between 150 and 400% of poverty, which is hard to know what that means, so let me break it down, about $20,000 to $54,000 for an individual, would pay over $1,000 more per person in annual premiums. A 60-year-old couple making $75,000 would see annual marketplace premium costs more than triple, rising from about $6,400 to more than $22,000. The premium spikes may also coincide with the end of the federal public health emergency, when millions of Medicaid enrollees no longer eligible for Medicaid coverage will need to secure coverage in the marketplace, making those premium tax credits incredibly important for assuring that they seamlessly are able to access coverage. The expiration of those premium tax credits would drive up the rate of uninsured, which we've actually made progress in driving down the rate of uninsured over the last year because of both the Medicaid continuous coverage provision as well as the expansion in premium tax credits.
Well, Ms. Parrott, let me ask about, and thank you for that answer. Another thing that I think was very, very beneficial, we in the Ways and Means Committee are proud of the tax credits that we enhanced, like the child tax credit. And there was another tax credit that had a major positive impact, not only in the finances of struggling businesses, but on our ability to fight the pandemic. The American Rescue Plan created paid family and sick leave tax credits that reimbursed employers who offered their workers paid time off because of the COVID pandemic. And to be eligible, businesses needed to give employees paid leave to quarantine, get a vaccine, find a test, or care for a family member or child. Can you talk about the impact that this paid leave had on both employers who claimed the credits and workers who were able to take the time they needed to care for themselves and their families without losing their jobs or their paycheck? And what lessons can we learn from these credits as Democrats work to pass a national comprehensive paid leave plan?
Yeah, paid leave is a really good example of a place where, because of our underlying policies, we tried with some success to sort of fix things for purposes of the crisis. So we added some temporary paid leave measures, and for those who were able to benefit, I think those measures were quite helpful, both in stabilizing families' incomes when they needed to take time off and helping employers and employees stay connected. But the real, and you talked about this at the end of your question, the reality is that the United States stands alone among most wealthy nations in the world in not having some kind of paid family medical leave program for workers. And because of that, when people are unable to work because they need to care for their own illness or an illness in their family or welcome a new child into their household, too often they are forced to separate from their jobs. That's bad for the economy and it's bad for families. And so, trying to shoehorn something during the pandemic provided some help to some people, and that's really important. But the real path forward is getting to a place where all workers have access to paid family medical leave when they need it.
Thank you. I yield back.
Gentlewoman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Obernolte, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Dr. Coronado, in your testimony, you said something I completely agree with. You said that diagnosing the drivers of inflation is key to crafting a response to it. And you've answered a couple of questions about this already. I was interested in explaining why the United States has a substantially higher inflation rate than other countries. You said that you thought that deficit government spending, including the American Rescue Plan, was not even close to being the predominant cause. Several weeks ago, the San Francisco branch of the Federal Reserve issued a report in which they were investigating why the United States has a higher interest rate, higher inflation rate than other countries. And they reached the opposite conclusion. They concluded that deficit government spending here, in particular, the American Rescue Plan, was the predominant cause of why inflation was higher here than in other countries. Have you read that report, and do you disagree with it?
I am familiar with that report, and since the data that was used for that report, we've seen a pretty marked acceleration in core inflation across other countries. So in some senses, that finding is stale. That now that
like
gap.
we're talking apples and oranges here. They were talking about why last year the United States had higher inflation than other countries.
Correct.
You're saying it doesn't matter now because everyone has high inflation.
Well, we
We're
have
talking about
we have to
why
keep,
we got out ahead.
We have to keep learning about the from the incoming data, and what we're seeing is that there is a considerable rise in inflation across countries. As you saw some of these charts that have been presented, there sometimes is a lag between when things happen. And what we've seen is that a lot of this supply chain inflation, other countries, because their recoveries were delayed, the US recovery was strong and early, other recoveries was delayed. So as that spending came forward, you did start to see that supply chain inflation take hold too. So I'm not one to say it had no impact. There is an impact. And there's also a benefit. There's a cost and a benefit to providing very strong support. So I'm not saying there's no impact or there isn't a meaningful cause in the wedge. The wedge that I estimate now is, maybe a percentage point.
Well, let's talk about it worldwide then.
Mm-hmm.
So, the WTO has been looking at the same issue,
Mm-hmm.
from a worldwide perspective, not just a U.S.-centric perspective. And
Mm-hmm.
Robert Koopman, who's the chief economist of the WTO, has estimated that between, he says, 2/3 and 3/4 of supply shortages worldwide are a result of excess demand resulting from government spending. So do you agree or disagree with that?
So I do. There's more, I put more weight on the first part of that and less on the second part of that. So remember, a very key development in the pandemic globally was the shift to goods spending over services spending. So that's unprecedented. We have not seen that kind of shift in consumer spending in our lifetimes ever since actually the last time we saw this kind of shift was World War II.
Sure, but the WTO is saying that as a result of all of this excess money being injected into worldwide economies.
So that's the part that I take more issue with.
Okay, well, so you disagree with the Federal Reserve, you disagree with the WTO. The CBO, well, you know what, we're not going to get into
The Federal Reserve is a big system with hundreds of economists, all of which have an opinion. So I agree with the Federal Reserve and disagree with the Federal Reserve, depending on the analyst we're talking about.
I understand, but I think that, and this isn't a question, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that majority of economists now would acknowledge that government spending has played a substantial role, if not the predominant role, in catalyzing the growth of inflation. And this leads me to my last question, which I'll go to Ms. Parrott. And this is, it's been an interesting hearing. We've got these two ideas in tension, which is what Dr. Coronado was just talking about. The fact that the American Rescue Plan undoubtedly catalyzed this round of inflation. We can argue about how much, but undoubtedly contributed to it, if not caused it. And you've testified that the American Rescue Plan was, what you said, the most substantial anti-poverty legislation since 1935. So, here's the question was it worth it? Was this round of inflation that's leading to interest rate hikes, the Fed is meeting today, was it worth that, had that result for the good that the legislation did?
So I think you set up a false counterfactual. So, the American Rescue Plan helped strengthen the recovery, reduce unemployment, lots more people working. I agree with Dr. Coronado. I think I wouldn't say that it had no effect on inflation, but I do think we would be facing high inflation today, regardless of whether we had the American Rescue Plan. But I also think that in the absence of the American Rescue Plan, we would have had more kids in poverty. We would have seen a spike in evictions. We would have seen a lot of people struggling. And so I'm not going to speak to a false counterfactual that I don't think is accurate. But what I will say is that the American Rescue Plan made an enormous difference in the lives of tens of millions of people and in communities across the country.
All right. Well, I see that I'm out of time. It's an interesting discussion, but here is, what really depresses me about this argument is that, you also have to consider the effects of inflation on the impoverished here in America. And it's been said that inflation is one of the most regressive taxes because it disproportionately affects the people who can least afford to pay for it. And, we're in a situation now where
the gentleman's time is long expired.
All right. Okay. Well, thank you for the thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the extra time.
All right. Gentleman's time has expired. Now recognize the gentlewoman from the U.S. Virgin Islands, Ms. Plaskett, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for this hearing. Thank you for the ability to question the witnesses. I find it so interesting and specious that one of the witnesses say that we should take advice from Donald Trump, who before coming to the presidency was a failed businessman, who had companies that went bankrupt. That's who we're supposed to take business advice from? The most recent hearings have shown that not only is he a failed businessman, but he's a con artist who created a slush fund off of the backs of American people through his attempt to overthrow our government through January 6th. So will I take advice from someone like that? I think not. And I think our country is better off without having him as the leader of our country at this point. We've had a lot of discussions about child tax credit and the American Rescue Plan and what it has or has not done. For people living in families living in the U.S. Virgin Islands, by extending the child tax credit to the territories and providing that funding, there has been an enormous uplifting of children that are living in poverty. Ms. Parrott, would you explain to us how the Medicaid provisions in the reconciliation bill passed by the House Democrats in November of 2021 would improve access to healthcare and equity for low-income Americans living in the territories?
Yes, thanks you for your question. This issue doesn't always get the attention that it deserves. The Medicaid provisions in the 2021 House Reconciliation Bill ensures that people in U.S. territories can continue to get the health care they need by increasing Medicaid funding to the territories, which, unlike states, receive capped federal funding for Medicaid that can and sometimes does run out. The bill passed by the House included a permanent increase to the block grants, as well as an increase in the federal government's share of Medicaid funding for the territories. Now, I want to be clear, the bill did not provide full parity with state Medicaid programs because it would continue to provide annual allotments of federal funds rather than the kind of open-ended funding stream that states receive to meet their residents' health care. Ultimately, parity is what people in the territories need and deserve. But the amount of the House-passed allotments, along with the realistic growth factor based on actual Medicaid costs and the increase in the federal government's share of their Medicaid costs, would provide the stable and adequate funding the territories need to bring them closer to what states provide by increasing eligibility, benefits, and provider payments. This is a key core equity issue, and I thank you for the question.
Thank you. We're talking about children. We also, of course, have to then talk about working parents. One of my colleagues talked about not being able to go to restaurants, but we know for many working families, the ability to have proper childcare is still not there. The pandemic has affected childcare, has affected those children who are not vaccinated, who families do not feel safe bringing them or do not have the support for them to go back to work. Not all of us have had the luxury of working from home. Many of us have had to go to work in some instances and had to find childcare. Childcare providers were also hit very hard. Many closed or could not keep talented staff who are struggling through the pandemic as well. Again, Ms. Parrott, how has the Child Care and Development Block Grant help working parents afford their child care?
So the Child Care and Development Block Grant, which sometimes we wrongly shorthand as CCDBG, which is hard to say and remember, provides funding to states that allows them to provide subsidies to parents with low earnings to cover the cost of childcare. And it also does a lot to actually improve the quality of childcare for all children. CCDBG provides critical but underfunded support to state childcare programs, and most families eligible for childcare assistance don't get it because of inadequate resources. During the pandemic, as you mentioned, many childcare providers closed or reduced their capacity. And when parents were ready to come back to work, many couldn't find childcare or they couldn't afford it. When families can't access quality, affordable childcare, they're left with really quite terrible choices. Stop working or reduce hours, which is often impossible to do and make ends meet, or use more informal, lower quality care. The American Rescue Plan provided $39 billion in additional childcare funding, including funding for CCDBG, as well as funding for stabilization grants. This was incredibly important. It helped shore up the childcare providers, it helped people stay in business or expand capacity. It also expanded help to families, raising eligibility thresholds, reducing co-pays, and also increased compensation for childcare workers, who I think, along with those municipal workers that Mayor Williams talked about, are true heroes of this time period.
I've run out of time, but if my colleagues, who I understand are so concerned with the life of a child, let's make sure that we do that throughout the child's life, even after they're born. And I yield back.
Gentlewoman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Donalds, for 5 minutes.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Witnesses, panelists, thanks for being here. I find it interesting that we're talking about the American Rescue Plan since it just didn't work, guys. I mean, come on, I'm a finance guy by trade. I just got to Capitol Hill. Couple things. I know the witnesses have said previously that the benefits of the American Rescue Plan have been the potential evictions for people not having enough money to pay rents, decrease in child poverty. Those are like the big two. Well, we'll come back to that. Give me a second. We'll get there. But it's without question that the American Rescue Plan has led to inflation. Every economist basically has said this. I mean, look, if you want to talk about inflation, you have a lot of money going to people, right, wrong, or indifferent, money went to people. They didn't have to earn it, which means productivity in the economy is actually down. So people have money, but productivity is down. But when people will take that money to go spend it, I mean, yes, doctor, this is kind of how this works. When they take the money to go spend it in an economy where productivity is down because there's not enough supply of goods and services available, prices then go up in response because productivity is down, but everybody's got money. That's how we get to inflation. The job market, let's talk about that one real briefly. Yes, coming out of the time when the American economy was shut down by government policy because of COVID-19, the job market suffered major hits. But it's virtually without question that in the red states that had opened up, I'm the gentleman from Florida, I know, the job market actually responded quite well to businesses being able to open up and operate. It was in blue states where the job market did not respond as well. But we all knew up here on Capitol Hill that if you just, opened up, the businesses would come back. Look no further than right here in DC. Muriel Bowser's policies basically wrecked the restaurant market here in DC. Most people could not go to work in DC. There was no traffic coming into DC. And the second she alleviated COVID-19 policies, businesses started opening up again, people started going back to work, etc. So I don't think we needed about $2 trillion to recover jobs in the United States. I think what we really needed was just sound, local government policy or state government policy to just open up economies, because the states that did that, that's what happened. I want to speak to inflation specifically, because this is where we are now. The trip down memory lane was cool. One thing I will say about the states and local governments is that when the American Rescue Plan came through, I know myself and several of the members were looking for an Excel spreadsheet about what states and localities actually needed and what they perceived were going to be the shortfalls in their budget. There was a funding formula that was created, but there was no spreadsheet about, okay, New York needs this, Mayor Williams, your city needs X, Los Angeles needs Y, Miami, Florida needs Z. There was no spreadsheet or no allocation. There was no back and forth that actually rose to a number. It was a funding formula. And they just picked a number out of the air and said, we're going to spend X amount of money to state and local governments. So when state and local governments have money to spend, not quite sure what they're going to spend it all. Some figured it out, some didn't. You have a glut of money sitting out there in the economy that gets spent in reckless means. And I'm going to bring this back to the productivity point. People were not working to the degree that they need to work in an economy like ours, which means product is not available for purchase to the degree of the amount of money that's out there to purchase, which means prices go up. Mayor Williams, you said earlier that your constituents would still say that the American Rescue Plan is still a good thing in spite of the inflation that has been created in the United States. Do you think your constituents would actually choose paying $65 per fill-up or the American Rescue Plan?
Thank you for that question. I'm not going to play that game. You know, I mean,
I'm going to reclaim my time right there.
Yeah, reclaim your time.
They're going to have to fill up. It's $65, man. Look, I got a sedan.
I know how much it is. Sir, I know how much it is. I just got a text from my daughter yesterday.
I know how much it is.
She spent $65. She spent $75 to fill her tank up.
And what's better?
But you know, the American Rescue Plan saved human lives. So I am not going to equate the price of gas over a human life.
Let's talk about human lives. Let's talk about this. The COVID-19 vaccinations were basically ready for distribution around January 2021. That's when they were ready for deployment. They were deployed out in a systematic fashion. If you look at the deployment rate per day of COVID-19 vaccines, there was no change in the rate per day between the Trump administration and the Biden administration. There was no change. As a matter of fact, the Biden administration was slow in vaccine deployment. They had to actually drop the FEMA sites that they were doing because it was the most inefficient way. They actually had to follow the Ron DeSantis model, which was actually giving it to pharmacies so they can deploy the vaccines in a much more efficient manner. Thanks, Mr. Chairman. This was fun. I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired, and now recognize the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Series, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing today. You know, I couldn't agree with my colleague, Stacey Plaskett. When people refer to Donald Trump as an economist and take his advice to run the economy, they should only turn to New Jersey and how he ran the Trump casino to the ground and how he left people holding the bag because he refused to pay for the work. And his attitude was, well, take me to court. This is how he made his money, abusing from the little guy. But Dr. Coronado, I'm here to talk a little bit about the recovery and from the pandemic that supposedly or did occur more swiftly than many forecasted. Is there an explanation why we missed the forecast, Dr. Coronado?
Yeah, I mean, we had never provided as much support in as direct a fashion as we have. There's always some uncertainty around what we call the fiscal multiplier. How much bang for your buck did you get? And I think one of the things we're learning is that providing direct support to households gives you a big bang for your buck.
Yeah, I always get a kick because it's always looking backwards and attacking some of the things that basically maybe have not gone as swiftly, as smoothly as could have gone. And it makes for great political points. But can you also tell me the role of the rescue plan in spurring the recovery? If it wasn't for that, what would have happened?
Yeah, absolutely. So when you give people the money that they need to pay their rent, to buy their food, to pay for all the needs and even some things that are not necessities, that money is revenue to some business. And then that business then hires employees. And again, we had tremendous profitability and productivity over the past year. And so, you know, from a macroeconomic standpoint, the money going into the economy is going to create that kind of activity, profits, jobs, incomes. It's a positive feedback loop. That's in fact the definition of a recession versus an expansion is taking the economy out of a negative feedback loop where job losses and uncertainty begets more job losses and uncertainty, and putting it into a positive feedback loop where spending creates jobs, creates more spending, creates more jobs. And that is, in fact, what the American Rescue Plan, that's the dynamic it helped foster.
Thank you. Mayor Williams, as a former mayor, I understand how impactful state and federal funding are to starting and maintaining a city's program and services. I can tell you that in my district, many of the mayors were starting to panic during the pandemic because they didn't know if help was coming or not. They didn't realize they weren't getting the amount of money coming in as they thought they were getting. Can you talk a little bit about how your town prioritized the funding it received from the American Rescue Plan?
Thank you, Representative. Certainly, how we prioritize the use of the funding in our city was certainly first and foremost to our first responders, police and fire and public services or public works, those folks who had to be in work that could not work from home. So certainly that was important to us. But also, I spoke earlier about the rental assistance, mortgage assistance, utility assistance, but also assisting families with food insecurities. We had families, because schools were shut down, there were families whose kids were going to school, and we know this for a fact, that when kids are going to school, usually that meal that they get at school is the only meal that they have. So we wanted to make sure that we took care of that, but not just have one meal a day, 3 meals a day throughout the week. And we did that and still are doing that to make sure that our families are secure as it relates to food and other necessities such as Wi-Fi and all of those types of things that keeps the community's quality of life flowing, but also people deserve that. This is about, our piece of the promise for all of American citizens, so we've got to make sure that we keep that focus first and foremost. Thank you.
Thank you. One of the things that I'm most proud of my community is how they handle this, especially the lunch program for kids. If it wasn't for the lunch programs that we had, a lot of kids would have gone hungry. I see that my time is up. Thank you, Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Grothman, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. First of all, a general comment, because some of these things just really irritate me. It bothers me that we have people before me today who find it so easy to print so much money. Because when you do that and create inflation, you are just destroying the people on fixed incomes, on pensions, which eventually will really rip into people whose savings were their whole life. They rely on that savings. They think it's going to be when they retire. All of a sudden, the value of the dollar falls. And for you, it's just like no big deal. It's my money. It's my pension. I can do with it whatever I want because I'm part of the government. And you have hurt people so much through this inflation. I think for the first time since I've been in politics, there's genuine fear back home as you've driven not just cost of gas, but the cost of housing through the roof. I think the amount of inflation, the official numbers are way understated, and you really may have taken big steps towards destroying the American dream. I think as far as talking about people who couldn't work during the pandemic, when I go home at night, I go buy 3 cheese plants, big cheese plants. And I saw those people because they were considered required working or necessary working. Those plants the parking lots were filled even if I went home at midnight. There were people working 3 shifts around the clock and they didn't have a problem doing it. And to this day, I believe a lot of the government people who ordered people at home unnecessarily, because all those working people who provide our food, they were out there working all the time, and people shouldn't have ordered all these other people to stay at home. Now, I will comment a little around the time that this debacle, and I'll mention, I should say debacles, because not only this bill that we're looking at today, but that infrastructure bill was another complete debacle, another over $1 trillion just put into the economy like it wasn't going to hurt anything. But we'll give Mr. Moore a question here. One of the things I notice over time, and it's maybe one of the reasons why I'm afraid we're going to have a poor America, is the over time lowering labor rate participation of men. I don't care who we take men across the board, men aged 25 to 55. There has over a period of years been a dramatic decrease in the labor participation rate there. I'm not sure how much is kind of this anti-man feeling that's out there. I don't know how much is across the board unemployment benefits, but could you comment on the reduction in the percentage of men working both over the last 10 years and over the last 30 years?
Look, economics really isn't very complicated, Mr. Grothman. If you pay people not to work, they won't work. And if you increase the rewards to working, you'll get more work. It's not complicated. This is just a law of economics. And that's why I mentioned earlier in my testimony, I'll go back to that. We should have cut the payroll tax. We shouldn't have expanded all these programs. I mean, this idea that all we have to do is give people money. I mean, one of the previous witnesses saying, oh, we gave people money for healthcare. We gave money for their food. We gave money for people for money for the rent. Wouldn't it be a wonderful world if we could solve all our economic problems by just giving people money? I mean, it would be a wonderful thing. I wish that worked.
I think you're hitting on something that should be obvious. Larry Summers, one of Obama's top advisors, said at the time, I think this is the least responsible economic policy in 40 years. I think more recently, Steve Ratner, Democrat, the $1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan passed in the early days of the Biden administration will go down in history as an extraordinary policy mistake. And I think that's what happens when we have people who think that the reason America is a great, vibrant economy and the envy of the rest of the world, probably almost since we were founded, is because we believe in freedom, okay? And we believe in people making their own wealth and finding a job and earning their own money. And there are other people who think wealth comes from the government either printing money or taxing money or going deeper into debt. And obviously those people right now are running the show. Everything any lobbyist could think of or any cool idea that one of the squad could think of wound up in these bills. And now here we sit. I think the only way, I'll ask you, I think the only way to get rid of the inflation, you look how we got rid of inflation in the 80s. It wasn't good, although we eventually did get rid of it. And it's something we've got to get rid of to get America back on the straight and narrow. And I don't know whether we have elected officials anymore who have the integrity to say no to the people back home, or whether they think they run for re-election, putting on their campaign literature, look at all the money I took from the public and spread out for everybody under the sun. Like I said, I think of all those hardworking people in my district who were working third shift through this thing without complaining a bit. And nevertheless, we had politicians ordering people to stay at home. And after they ordered them to stay at home, they pretended like it was something beyond their control. It's just unbelievable.
Well, Mr. Grothman, at the peak of when we were paying people $600 a week unemployment benefits, plus rental assistance, plus expanded food stamps, plus Medicaid, plus the $300 child per credit, Casey Mulligan of the University of Chicago and I did a study that found that you had families in many states with two parents and two kids that could make $80,000 to $100,000 in government benefits and not work a single hour. And the reason I mention that, you know who that's unfair to? The people you're talking about, the people working double shifts and sometimes triple shifts, working 50 hours a week, and they're making less money than people on. Look, I'm for a safety
Yes,
act.
nobody gives a damn about the working man nowadays. Nobody cares about the working man.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Oh, by the way, just wanted to comment. Part of that free spending happened a little bit under our buddy Trump, too. You
It
got to
did.
admit.
Yeah,
He
it's the
spent
CARES
so
Act
much as well. Yep. Okay.
Gentleman's time has expired. And now recognize the gentlewoman from Washington, Ms. Jayapal, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. That was very instructive, that last 5 minutes. Let me just take on several points. The other side gives money out too. Let's be really clear. That's the $2 trillion tax cut that Donald Trump passed with Republican votes. And that is a tax cut that went to the top 10% of the country. And that's if you're generous, it went to the top 10%. So don't tell me that you don't like to give out free money, because you're giving it out all the time. Let's look at, if you want to look at a debacle, how about the debacle of what's happening right now with oil and gas companies profiteering, and the profits of these corporations going up massively, even as working people across this country cannot afford their gas at the pump. This is profiteering, and it's not just by those oil companies. Look at the food companies, look at the agriculture companies. You are seeing people profiteering right now, and those are the people that our colleagues on the other side of the aisle want to help. The difference here is that Democrats want to help regular working people, folks who are struggling across the country just to make ends meet. That's what Democrats are about. And that's why when you look at the American Rescue Plan, it was an unmitigated success. And it was an unmitigated success for the right group of people, for the 90% of Americans who desperately need the help, not for the top 10% that the Republicans are always trying to deliver freebies for. No, the reality is our economy was devastated by the pandemic. Unemployment was at its lowest levels in over half a century, but President Biden and Democrats acted boldly to deliver a relief package that met the scale of the crisis. And thanks to the American Rescue Plan, the US economy has rebounded faster than anyone predicted. It helped people stay in their homes. We have cut hunger by 25%. We've cut child poverty in half. We've helped wages to rise. Unemployment is down to 3.6%, a level that the Congressional Budget Office did not predict we would reach for the entire decade. A level, by the way, that is the lowest level of unemployment in over half a century. So you want to talk about a debacle, talk about the economy under Donald Trump that rewarded only the richest people and the Republican tax cut of several years ago. You want to talk about success for working people, talk about the American Rescue Plan. Now, let me get back to my questions. After just 2.5 years, we've returned the US labor market back to its pre-pandemic strength. And our recovery has been much more equitable in stark contrast to the response to the Great Recession. Dr. Coronado, can you elaborate on why it was so important to go big and provide meaningful relief quickly, and how this response contrasts to the Great Recession?
Yeah, so there is a lot of research that shows when people are unemployed for an extended period of time or out of the labor force for an extended period of time, it leaves a permanent imprint on their earnings capacity. So their wages, the wages that they return to the labor force at are lower, and the growth is slower, and they are more prone to spells of unemployment down the road. There's lots of evidence of this, which is why speed is important. It is important not just to restore the economy, but to bring people back in. There's been a lot of talk of people being on the sidelines. That has been turning around with great force. People were on the sidelines for a lot of reasons, because of childcare problems, because of health concerns, even after the lockdowns were lifted. So it was a complex and difficult situation for many families. That is now beginning to heal, and we are seeing the labor force participation of prime age people. We're on track to exceed the pre-pandemic levels in the next 6 months. So there is no problem with people's willingness to work. They want to, and now, as you noted, the structure of the benefits is going disproportionately to lower wage workers who have had decades and decades of underperformance. We have seen widening income inequality since the 1980s. And for the first time since then, we are seeing actually wage gains much stronger, twice the pace for the lowest quintile of workers as it is for the top quintile of workers. I just want to clarify one other point of red versus blue states. Since I live in a red state, the cities are blue, and we definitely took advantage of all the the American Rescue Plan programs. Our mayor heartily engaged in providing assistance to renters to keep them in. We are a service sector city. We got hit, I'm in Austin, we got hit really hard, and we bounced back really fast, in large part because a lot of these programs kept people going.
Well, I'm going to ask you a quick question because my last colleague went over on time, so I know my time is expired. But really quickly, Mr. Chairman, the last part of the U.S. response was necessary because of holes in our existing supports. What could we do differently so that the help that people need during a crisis are in place automatically? Dr. Coronado.
Yeah, so again, I think one of the things that these programs did expose were some of the creakiness of the infrastructure in terms of getting money to people. I think we actually did incredibly well but the IRS is stretched to breaking point in terms of its ability. The unemployment insurance systems at the state level experienced a lot of technical difficulties in administering these programs. So I think that there's a lot that can be done in terms of modernizing the digital infrastructure, both at the IRS and at the unemployment insurance system, to bring it up to date and make sure that we can get money to people quickly, identify who's eligible, get the money quickly. That would certainly facilitate the efficiency of these programs.
Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. Now recognize the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Carter, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank all of you for being here today. I appreciate your attendance here, particularly you, Mayor Williams, a fellow Georgian. Thank you. And just full disclosure, I was a mayor in another life as well, so I appreciate your service and appreciate you being here from the great county of Fulton and the great city of Union City. I'm very familiar with it. Mr. Mayor, I wanted to ask you, you've had great praise for the American Rescue Fund and for the funds that it brought to our state. And I say our state because it's your state, my state, state of Georgia. But I haven't heard you say a whole lot about the fact that the state of Georgia, under our governor, Brian Kemp, that we were one of the first to reopen and that we were one of the ones who really never closed down completely. And I just want to ask you, with all due respect, how do you differentiate between the impact of the state reopening, allowing people to get back to work and to school, and the impact of the American Rescue Plan? I mean, how do you differentiate between those two?
Well, thank you. And certainly, no, I had not spoken about Georgia and certainly our great governor, Brian Kemp. And Georgia is a blue state now, for those who don't know that.
I beg your pardon?
Well, Georgia.
I'm talking about Georgia and the Southeast.
But anyway, we're talking about Georgia in its entirety. But I did want to certainly say that Georgia was one of the first states to stay open. But it was a challenge for most of the communities in Georgia who had struggles with people who were not essential workers, people who didn't have public transit access. There were a number of factors as to why a lot of the folks that were employed and needed to get to work couldn't get to work, but also a lot of the jobs were shut down because of the pandemic. Certainly the state was still open, but a lot of people couldn't work. So, there were a lot of variables in that, Congressman, but we have to be focused on how do we get people to work in an open environment. Many of us were afraid because we didn't have the necessary health care, the necessary testing that needed to be done to get people to work, but also our schools were shut down. There was a big fight, as you know, in Georgia about schools being open, being closed. So that was a big challenge.
Mr. Mayor, again, and I don't mean to be confrontational here, but I'm afraid that we certainly disagree with red and blue, but nevertheless, I'm afraid we disagree with which one really, which one had the most impact and the most benefit here. I mean, opening early didn't cause the inflation that we're experiencing right now. It didn't cause the high need for employees that we're experiencing right now. I know in your city alone, I believe I've got the figures here that according to Indeed.com, a job search engine, there are 6,730 open restaurant jobs within 25 miles of Union City, Georgia. And it's all this money that was pumped into the economy, particularly by the American Rescue Plan, which in my opinion was not necessary. Now, there were programs that were necessary, programs that I voted for. The CARES Act, PPP program, EIDL, all of those were important. And they helped these people out, as you indicate. But the American Rescue Plan has resulted in the high inflation and the need for employees that we have right now. We've simply got too many dollars chasing after too few products right now. But opening up the economy, that is what helped us in the state of Georgia recover from this.
All due respect, you mentioned the CARES Act. The CARES Act did not help cities like my city. There were only 36, 37 big cities that received CARES Act funds. The CARES Act funding went to The county, Fulton County.
Okay, but
certainly that was a challenge we had in having discussions
but
with
Fulton
the
County had the ability to have it designated to you as well in the city.
Well, let me tell you, that was a huge,
I understand.
Okay,
I'm familiar with
well,
Fulton County. Enough said.
Okay.
But when we talk about the American Rescue Plan, all I've heard you say is that you were able to finish a Greenway Trail. I mean, was
not
that
finished? Not finished.
Not finished.
No, I
It's
didn't
still
say
not
finished.
finished?
Yeah, I didn't say finish a Greenway Trail. It has allowed us to be able to move forward with the creation and implementation of a Greenway Trail. It is helping us to be able to create recreational outlets for our community. We're not finished with it.
Well, certainly that's important. I get it.
Yeah.
I was a mayor too, and I
Yeah.
understand that recreational trails are important to the life of the community, but I would submit that it's not important enough to where the federal government needs to be sending dollars down there that's going to result in inflation and what we see now and the need of employees and businesses struggling like they're struggling in my district and the 1st Congressional District along the coast of Georgia.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Mr. Chairman, thank you, and I'll yield back.
I now recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Klein, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you for holding this hearing on the so-called American Rescue Plan, something we've been asking to do for quite a while. The hearing has provided us with the opportunity to highlight some of the most disastrous impacts of the plan on the American economy and on American families, as well as the devastating inflation that's resulted. In fact, over the last 15 months, the economic outlook has also deteriorated in many aspects of society. The federal deficit in 2021 was $2.78 trillion, the second highest deficit in American history, and $517 billion more than CBO projected. So far this year, the Federal Reserve has already increased interest rates twice, by a quarter of a point in March and half a point in May, and expected to increase rates again later this week. Prior to ARPA, CBO projected no rate increases until 2024. The S&P 500 is down 16% from its peak. Productivity fell at a 7.3% annual pace last quarter, the largest decrease in 75 years. The labor force participation remains below what it was prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. Gas prices are above $5 a gallon, up 109% since Biden became president. Real wages have declined by 4.2% since Biden became president. And the federal debt has increased by almost $3 trillion and is on track to increase by another $16 trillion under the president's budget proposal, reaching the highest level in American history as a percentage of the economy. And what's even more egregious is much of the funding from this American Rescue Plan was lost due to fraud, unemployment insurance fraud. The government has confirmed at least $163 billion, which with third-party estimates as high as $400 billion. All of this because architects of the American Rescue Plan, congressional Democrats and the administration, refused to include guardrails such as identity verification, which would protect the funding. It's clear that much of the taxpayer-funded spending from the rescue plan was spent on policies that actually reduced labor force participation and spent on things completely unrelated to combating COVID-19. I want to ask Mr. Moore, as I said, interest rates are rising. You cite GDP will grow at less than a point in the second quarter. In your opinion, what does the next 6 months look like for the American consumer?
Look, I think this is a really dangerous time for the U.S. economy. We're at I'm kind of in agreement with one of the Jamie Dimon, who said last week that it just feels like we're on the beach and a tsunami is coming. And I hope I'm wrong. The last thing, I've lived through 6 recessions during my lifetime, deep recessions, and they're extraordinarily painful and they cause incredible pain and suffering. So I pray that we can skate around this. But Mr. Klein, what's bothered me, frankly, about this hearing is the quote, "It's not our fault," is not an economic strategy, right? To just say it's not our fault. I've been in economics for 35 years. I never even heard the term supply chain problems until Joe Biden came into office. Where did this idea of supply chain problems come? We had under Reagan, when we had the massive recovery, we had an 18-month period where the economy grew by 12%. There were no supply chain problems. The inflation rate fell. It didn't grow. Economic growth is associated with lower inflation. When you produce more goods and services, the inflation rate goes down. It doesn't go up. If the economy produces more apples, what happens to the price of apples? So I think what worries me right now, sir, is what's the solution? When Joe Biden says we should pass the Build Back Better bill and add another $2 or $3 trillion to the debt, it scares the hell out of me. That's the solution, more and more spending, more price controls. We had price controls in the 1970s, Mr. Klein, and it was a disaster. That's what led to gas lines and the collapse of the economy. So very worried about things. I think what we ought to do is call for an immediate 10 or 15% across the board cut in every government program. They've had 30% increases. Let's get government spending down quickly to help solve this inflation problem, make the tax cuts permanent, and let's suspend all this, green energy stuff for a while and produce what produces 70% of our energy, which is oil, gas, coal, nuclear power.
Thank you. I want to note that our colleague, Ms. Jayapal, who's not on right now, was talking about the pre-pandemic economy and how it was going, and it was going quite well due to the tax cuts that were passed by the Trump administration, by the Republican Congress prior to the pandemic. So I would hope that we would adopt some of the policies that you're recommending, and we can save this economy from sliding into a recession. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I now yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Iowa, Mr. Feenstra.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Yarmuth, and thank you, Ranking Member Smith. It's a pleasure to talk about this topic today. I appreciate the testimonies of each one of you concerning the American Rescue Plan and whether or not it was successful, and talk about the implications of it. My past, I taught business and economics at a university, and I quickly pulled out my public finance book, right? Because I wanted to clarify economics. And Mr. Moore, you noted that economics is really not complicated. It's not complicated. It's really about consumer satisfaction and how you get there. And the book, the first 5 sentences of the book, it talks about injecting cash into a system inherently creates inflation. It automatically does. Right? So that's what happened. That is factual, right? We do have inflation, runaway inflation, which is factual, whether Mrs. Yellen says that, Mr. Powell says that. I mean, this is fact. So now when you look at the economics piece of it, it also deals with utility. So as economists, when we look at utility, that means consumer satisfaction. So what happened with the American Rescue Plan? We injected all this money. Did we create consumer satisfaction? Well, let's think about that. When gas is up 48%, eggs are up 33%, utilities up 30%, milk up 16%, meat up 12%. Oh, and by the way, we're sitting here less than 24 hours after the S&P 500 closed in a bear market, dropping 20% in the last 6 months, threatening retirements of millions of seniors who have left the labor market. Do you think they're satisfied? No. I mean, this is why there's so much anger in America right now. People are furious because they have to make a decision. They have to make this decision. A rational person sitting around the table with their family has to make this decision. Do I work more? Economics. Do I have to get more money? Or do I have to cut going to the grocery store? Do I got to cut the pop? Or do I have to cut the meal for my kids? This is real. This is what Americans are facing. So you can talk about the American Rescue Plan, how glorious it is, and yet you have mom and dad sitting at the kitchen table trying to understand what they have to cut. Or does somebody have to get a second or third job? And the same thing with businesses. The businesses have seen dramatic inputs going up, going, all right, now what do we do? And this is scary stuff. You know, the chief economist of the World Trade Organization estimates that between 2/3 or 3/4 of the supply shortages are a result of excess demand, money put in the system, resulting from government spending. So we look at all this stuff, and this is, again, chief economist of the World Trade Organization saying this. This isn't Randy Feenstra. This is an expert. It is caused by all this money that's going into the system. More importantly, and it was just noted by Representative Klein, that it'd be something if we were all collaboratively sitting in this room today figuring out a plan to mitigate inflation. But no, we're not doing that. What we're doing is we're trying to revive Build Back Better. We're asking the president to forgive student loans, and we're also asking for more COVID dollars. Don't we understand the train wreck that is already happening? And it was just noted that, is there storm clouds on the horizon? No. It's a matter of a hurricane, and we're not sure if it's going to be a hurricane of a strength of 2, 3, 4, or 5. And it's scary because I think it could be a 5. This is how catastrophic this is going to be, because you know how you resolve the problem, and the feds get it. They're going up a 0.75% or 0.75 basis points this week, maybe even more, because they understand the only way you fight inflation is increasing your interest rates. And when you increase your interest rates, right, think about what happens. That slows down the economy, you create a recession, and all of a sudden, in a year from now, we're going to talk about extended high unemployment because businesses are going to have to lay off people because less people are buying product. Again, it's not necessarily me, it's economics. It's written about over and over and over again. I'm scared. The country is scared. And yet we're talking about spending more. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Now yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Carey, and give him time to sit down.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ranker. So in June of 2021, the EPA announced that $50 million from the American Rescue Plan would go to fund environmental justice initiatives. This money from a law that was supposedly meant for COVID relief went to environmental, climate-related programs across the country. For example, some of the money went to the city of Milwaukee for, quote, outreach and education through a Healthy People Homes and Neighborhood campaign. Last month, you guys, the Center of Budget and Policy Priorities, put out a report that called for flexible recovery funds because it offers states a tool to advance environmental justice. Congressional Democrats and the Biden administration's federal guidance for the state and local dollars use was purposely vague so that it could be used to advance their Green New Deal. In addition, $30 billion, with a B, was allotted through the American Rescue Plan for mass transit system improvements to reduce emissions. Not sure how that falls in line with COVID. So it's obviously that the American Rescue Plan looked to fund the administration's new Green Deal, doling out billions of dollars, taxpayer dollars, with little guidance on how those dollars should be used. So my question to you, Mr. Moore, how do you think this money allotted for climate change has contributed to the runaway inflation that we're now seeing?
Well, there's no question that climate change funding was a huge part, especially of the $1.1 trillion, well, I call it the Green New Deal bill, but they call it infrastructure bill. Look, when you raise energy prices, which is what we've been doing as we're trying. I mean, look, Biden's been very clear on this. He wants to go to zero on oil and gas development in the United States by 2030. So when you think about it, I mean, the high oil and gas price is something the Biden administration wants. They don't want people to use oil and gas. So a good way to do that is to raise the price of it. But my point is, when energy prices go up, the gas price, I'll tell you, I have a friend who, for example, I'll just give you one story. My friend owns restaurants, kind of middle income, like Denny's and Red Lobsters and so on. And he said, Steve, I can tell you what my sales the next week in my store will be based on what the gas price is today. In other words, I think a lot of people don't realize that 70% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck. And if the gas price goes up, I'm just using this one as an example, he said, they won't have the money to go to Red Lobster. They have to take the family to McDonald's or something like this. So this is why all this talk about inequality, inflation is the ultimate regressive tax that hurts the people at the bottom. That's why it's so inexcusable that we're allowing this to continue to go on and pretending that somehow we're helping the lowest income people, when in fact we're doing great damage to their living standards. And incidentally, I'll make this prediction, and Mr. Chairman, if I'm wrong, I will eat my words, but in 6 months, we're gonna see a huge increase in the poverty rate in this country, huge, because people's incomes can't keep pace with a 9% inflation rate. They just can't.
Thank you, Mr. Moore. I will tell you, I think we all know the term energy poverty. And I think what we're going to see, as you mentioned, in the next 6 months, we could see that. Again, I think what were some of the things, and we only have a minute, unfortunately, but we're going to see probably gas go up to $6 a gallon.
I hope not.
The cost of obviously domestic oil and gas recovery is limited. It's going up as everything else is. What do you think the rescue plan should have been focused on with domestic energy?
Drill. Use everything we've got. All of the above American strategy. I mean, I talked to Trump many times about this. It was basically, I used to say we can be energy independent with the right strategy. He said, I want America to be energy dominant. We should be. We have more oil and gas and coal than any other country in the world. We have 300 years worth of natural gas. We have 250 years worth of oil. We have 600 years worth of coal. We have the cleanest energy in the world. It makes no sense that we've shut down so much of our energy supply. I find it tragic.
Thank you, Mr. Moore. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I now yield myself 10 minutes, and thank you all for your patience. I'm the last questioner, so we'll get out of here. Ms. Boebert mentioned this is Donald Trump's birthday and wished him happy birthday. I want to acknowledge that today is National Bourbon Day. And coming from Kentucky, I think that's an important thing to get on the record. And I will be celebrating appropriately later in the day. Mr. Williams, Mayor Williams, thanks for being here. And you are more than the mayor of Union City. You are representing the League of Cities across the country. How many of the mayors that you're familiar with think the American Rescue Plan was a bad deal?
I know no mayors that think the American Rescue Plan was a bad deal.
And that's Republicans, Democrats,
it's Republicans and Democrats. We are a nonpartisan organization. So I have no mayors that have reached out and said, I think this is a bad deal, because we worked in concert with a lot of your committee members and certainly with the Biden administration to craft this legislation to make sure that cities did get direct funding.
Right. And one of the complaints about the CARES Act was that there was not enough flexibility offered, that the guidelines were too strict. And therefore, when we were crafting this legislation, that's what we wanted to do, was to give the cities and states and counties more flexibility in the use. And so obviously, that doesn't guarantee that everybody will use them for the best possible purpose. But the ranking member mentioned a list of things, and ones he mentioned, and I know he said there were more that he didn't mention, but didn't amount to $2 billion, which means that's less than 0.1% of the total investments made under the American Rescue Plan. So there are a lot of things that were done really well in my state, and I have a letter which I'll ask unanimous consent to enter into the record without objection. This is from the governor of the Commonwealth of Kentucky, talking about all the ways in which they have used, not all of them, but some of the prominent ways. And you mentioned some of them: water systems, broadband. We made a considerable investment in schools, both remediation of schools so that they're safer, but also construction of schools. And the point I raised there is not all of the benefits of the American Rescue Plan have been realized. There are many that will be realized as time goes on because of these important investments.
You're exactly right. And it was, mentioned during my conversation with member Carter, the Greenway Trail. for example. Those things take time. You know, certainly this is something that we are engaged in now in developing that resource to our community. But, you know, one of the great things that I do see have happened with this ARPA plan is that I am noticing and have noticed, not just in Georgia, in my city, but around the country, that elected officials at all levels have begun to somewhat work together in concert when it comes to the needs of people. It just concerns me that we still have a lot of this back and forth with a lot of our federal members who chose not to support it, and that's fine, that you're right. But when you think about the needs of the people of this nation, it is imperative that every person that has been sent to Washington to serve their communities, their districts, that they do the right thing when it comes to saving lives.
I totally agree. You know, we know that funding helps states and localities, we've said, survive the pandemic and make investments that are evidence-based and community-supported. I ask unanimous consent to enter a letter from Results for America into the record, which makes that case without objection. Now I'm going to, one question. It was this Fed report, the San Francisco Fed report was referenced earlier. What didn't the Fed issue a report within the last 6 months that said they had estimated that the American Rescue Plan accounted for less than 1% of the total inflation, like 0.6 or 0.7%?
So I'd have to look and I'm not familiar with that report, but there are numerous reports from, you know, there's 12 regional Federal Reserves. Right. Each has a research staff. All of them are doing research on these things. So if it's of use, I could gather the various reports and provide you with those references.
Okay, that would be appreciated. There's a recent one now that I'd like to mention and enter into the record. This is from Moody's Analytics. Mm-hmm. This is decomposing consumer price inflation year-over-year change through May 22nd on seasonally adjusted CPI, a total of 8.5%. That number's been mentioned frequently. Russian invasion of Ukraine, direct impact of higher commodity prices, 2.8%. Indirect impact of higher commodity prices, 0.7%. So according to this, 3.7%, 3.5%, or almost half actually, of the 8.5%, they say is directly or indirectly attributed to the Russian invasion. Stressed supply chains, 1.5%, labor shortages, 0.1%, reopening effect, 0.4%, energy regulation, 0. American Rescue Plan, 0.1%. So I'm sure there are people who will come up with different numbers, but these numbers are pretty revealing as well. And I want to turn to inflation for a minute because we hear a lot about gas prices. Mr. Moore, do you know what gas prices, the oil price of a barrel of oil was in January before the Russian invasion when Russia was actually aggregating troops nearby? But you know what it was a barrel?
Sorry, January of 2021?
2022.
22, I mean, I don't know, $3, $3.50, I don't know.
No, not a gallon, the oil, a barrel.
Oh, the oil
on
price.
The market, yeah.
Well, I know that the month that Trump left office, the oil price was about $60 to $65 a barrel. I don't know what it was. And
it was in the low 80s.
Wait, are you talking about January of 2021?
2022.
Oh, 22, yeah.
Yes,
okay.
Just weeks before the invasion, a barrel of oil was $80 to $85 a barrel. And it's now $120 a barrel. It's a pretty compelling evidentiary case that the invasion dramatically raised the increase in oil prices. And everybody wants to say, well, we ought to have an all-in policy. You just said that. What are we going to do? Are we going to tell the oil companies to drill more? You think they'll listen to us? You mentioned 11 million gallons a day. Does anybody else in the world produce as much as we do?
Sorry, does
any other country in the world produce as much oil as we do?
We're slightly now below. We were the number one producer when Trump left office, and we're now we've fallen below Saudi Arabia and Russia.
I don't think so. I think Saudi Arabia is 8.5 million barrels a day. And
I think Saudi Arabia is higher than we are. But my point is, when the price goes from $80 a barrel to $120 a barrel, we should be producing 15 or 20 million. I mean, we should.
And isn't it the case that the reason they're not producing more when they have 9 million acres of leases that they're not using right now in the United States that they make too much money at $120 a barrel. Why would they go out and explore for oil, by the way, which is not going to do anything today, tomorrow, or next month to alleviate the crisis, because it takes a long time to find oil and build that capacity. And just like the Keystone Pipeline you mentioned, how long will it take for that to be completed?
Well, we've said that for 10 years. I mean, we would have it completed if we hadn't continued to stop it. But look, my point is that when the price of oil goes up, production goes up. I mean, these companies are incredibly sensitive to the price of. Every additional dollar is an additional dollar of profit for them.
Their investors are demanding that they don't respond with drilling and investment.
And they know that electric cars are coming and it'll be an increasing factor. And to make a long-term investment now in drilling for more oil is something that in their economic interests and shareholder interests are something they're not.
But sir, the president says he wants to. He said he wanted to destroy the oil and gas industry.
He doesn't control.
He doesn't want oil and gas development.
He doesn't control the oil companies.
What's that?
He doesn't control the oil companies. He doesn't control Shell.
They just took hundreds of thousands of acres off limits. They just did 2 weeks ago in the middle of an
9 million acres already under lease that they have.
So when you talk to the people in the oil industry, you cannot have a red light, green light policy. You're talking about billions of dollars investment. You can't say, oh, you can drill, you can't drill, you can't. There's so much uncertainty. They're not going to do it.
Nobody has said he can't drill, but I have one that they can't drill. One other question before I conclude. My time will be up. And it just to try and set the record straight, you were talking about the corporate tax rate lowering under the Republican tax plan, which you were part of it, and how corporate tax revenues increased. What was the rate that corporations were paying before we lowered the tax rate from 35 to 21?
Our statutory rate, when you took account the federal rate and the state and local, we're at 40%.
What was the effective rate that corporations?
So what we did exactly. So the effective rate was much lower. Our plan. It
was much lower than 21%.
This is the essence of a bad policy, right? We had the highest tax rate in the world, and we weren't raising much revenue from it. So we cut the rate, and we're actually getting more revenue from it. Isn't that a better?
But they weren't paying 21% on average to begin with, were they?
They weren't. A lot of companies were paying zero.
They weren't, exactly.
The wind and solar industry have never paid a penny of
I don't understand. You can claim effectiveness on that basis, but that's probably an argument for another time. Anyway, my time is up, and we're going to have a vote in a minute. And what's that? Oh, they have called votes. So we have a vote. Anyway, once again, thanks to all the witnesses. We truly appreciate your responses, your testimony, and I'm sure this argument and debate will not conclude, but we've had a vibrant and animated discussion, and I appreciate that. With that, if there's no further business, the hearing